Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is 12/12, which is a day that Americans and Europeans all agree is the 12th of December, regardless of which 12 comes first. I'm about to jump into voice with Mr. Agent Smith and see what is happening with the world. Wait, where is he? Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Hello?
Hey, how are you?
Good. Staying warm, staying cozy. It's pretty gross outside. Just above freezing and raining.
Oh,
Pretty windy. Not the best of conditions, but it's a great day to stay inside and play video games.
that's why I like that kind of weather.
Yeah. I didn't want to go outside anyway.
Yeah, very true in my case.
Well, we didn't
How
have
have you
a...
been?
Huh?
How have you been?
Pretty well. We had some guild drama that I had to sort out last week, which is why we didn't do a thing, but that was handled. Basically dealing with chronic misbehavior from someone after getting lots of feedback, so there's a point where even someone who's been on the team for a long time can get kicked out, and that's, I think, more difficult whenever someone has a mix of really awesome qualities, but then they have behavior that you can't stand, and you have to say these are the rules of the house, and as the boss, it's my job to yeet someone from the team if they break the rules too many times. One of the less fun parts of leadership.
Well, somebody's got to wield the big stick sometimes.
Yep, bonk. I got it this time. And I watched some documentaries, which I'm excited to talk to you about. There was
Oh,
one
cool.
that you've already talked about some, but I got a lot of cool visuals with it, and it was just cool to get a refresh because it's a really weird conflict that maybe it shouldn't have happened, but the Falkland Islands.
Oh, yeah.
It was a 3-part series, and the thing that's really funny about this is how hecking far away the Falklands are from Britain, and just
Yeah.
the whole context of why would you, as Argentina, go do that? Why would you go, like, I guess they're trying to, this is my understanding, there's a general in Argentina who takes power. He's kind of a dictator, not a good person. People are mad at him. Argentina is not in a good spot. And he's thinking, hey, I'm trying to win favor with my people. What could I do? Liberate the Falkland Islands from the Britons, who I guess he pitched it as they're actually Argentinian and they just want us to save them. We've heard this many times before in war. So they
Okay.
use that as the pretense to go over there and take over. And it's not like super heavily defended or anything, so they kind of have a walkover, just taking the place because it's just civilians there. And then
Exactly.
and then Britain actually decides to project power halfway around the world. And it's, I guess, a stage of the British Navy that you don't really get to see anywhere else because they have all the modern stuff. It's, what, early 80s? So they have the really high-tech ships. They have planes on the ships that are able to land back on the ships. Marines, Navy, and Army were all sent. And it was a pretty big operation with how much material they shipped all the way around the world.
Yeah, it was a heavy lift, especially for them at that point, because the British economy had not been doing well in the 1970s.
Hmm.
They were really hurting. There were some projections at the time that Britain might become one of the poorest countries in Europe within a few decades. So they were not in a good space. But by the time the Falklands War happened, things had started to turn around. And also, Thatcher just was willing to take the risk. I mean, you talk about how modern Britain's military was, but Argentina also had some new toys as well. And one of the newer technologies at the time, relatively speaking, were anti-ship missiles. And even though Argentina didn't have much of a navy, they had a decent number of aircraft, and they had Exocet anti-ship missiles, which are a pretty decent French anti-ship missile, and it only takes one to kind of ruin your day, if you're serving on a ship.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very risky endeavor to send the Royal Navy down there because the Argentine Air Force definitely had home field advantage. And there wasn't any guarantee that they would be able to, that is to say, the UK would be able to establish sufficient air superiority to stop Argentina's Air Force from coming in and sinking naval vessels. So, as was, they were able to do that, partly with the help of the Harriers. They were able to kind of intercept any would-be attackers. I think they were using French planes at the time in Argentina, if I'm not mistaken. They were using that weird thing. Oh, what was it? It wasn't a Dassault. That was sort of the main plane that the French export around the world, the Mirage series of planes in particular. But I think the Argentines were using something else. Oh, that's going to bug the hell out. Somebody in chat probably knows. They can
Rafale?
correct me. Huh? Oh, the Rafale?
Yeah.
No. No, that's the new one. This would have been back in the early 80s. I think the Rafale was still on the drawing board at that time. I want to say it's something that starts with an E, like Eduardo or something, which sounds a little silly. Let's see. Falklands. I'm sure listening to me type is very entertaining. I apologize.
We gotta double check this to make sure it's right, dude.
Oh, that's what it was. Super Atendard. Probably butchering the pronunciation. Yeah, that's what it was. Oh, that was Dassault. Okay. It wasn't a Mirage, but it was a Dassault. I'll post a link in your Discord thing here. If I can find it. There you are. Yeah, they'd bought a bunch of those, and those were capable of carrying the Exocet. So those were particularly dangerous, but the British Harriers were able to intercept them. Also, they had anti-air missiles. I mean, they sent a whole carrier battle group. I'm sure they covered that in the documentary.
Mm-hmm. So the advantages that it seemed like they had was the British troops were a lot better trained and equipped. There were a bunch of what were called Chicos, who were basically very young men or boys who were in the Argentinian force on the ground. Their planes and stuff were good, so Argentina wasn't like super behind in tech, but just for like the minimum troop training level, the Britons brought a lot higher quality than Argentina did.
Yeah.
I heard the biggest loss for the Britons was an anti-ship missile was dropped by a plane onto a ship before it was fully unloaded. So a bunch of people died in that. And the mistake was they could have let the soldiers off before they let the equipment off, but they wanted to get the equipment off first, so all the people died. But aside from that, it was a pretty one-sided exchange.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Argentine government was kind of hoping that the British would just kind of give up because it was so far away.
Mm-hmm.
No such luck. It was a little too politically attractive for the Thatcher government at the time.
So what was Thatcher's reason for being really severe about it? Or I guess just taking it really seriously?
Well, besides the fact that it's British territory and that they have an obligation to defend the people there, there was also the fact that Thatcher was very much a reformer who wanted to rejuvenate Britain. Again, the 70s was a really rough decade for Britain. There was just lots and lots of strikes that hobbled the economy. The energy crisis hit them really hard. Just economic growth in general was not great. So there wasn't a lot of opportunities, and just everybody was upset.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a rough period, and Thatcher kind of wanted to lead the way out of that. famously, she wanted to liberalize the economy, so that was one thing she wanted to do. But in general, she also just kind of wanted to improve morale, so to speak, and
Mm.
going on, engaging in a war to protect British territory and successfully doing so, even though there was some question about the efficacy of the British military in the early 1980s. That was a challenge worth taking if it would mean that the country was reinvigorated in the way that she was looking to do. So that was another reason that she was particularly keen on that conflict.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't look at it on a map until seeing this, but man, it's so far south. They were saying the strategic advantage of Britain holding this is it gives access to like research stations in Antarctica, which it doesn't seem like a huge ticket item, but there is some strategic value in holding that. And it's so far south that it kind of looks like Ireland. Just the landscape there. They have like peat bogs and stuff like that, the same as up there. So it's not. Was thinking of it like some tropical battle that was happening. It's not tropical. It's a temperate zone.
Yeah, yeah, it's way south. It's much closer to Antarctica than it is to the equator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we here in America, for those of you who are listening who are not from America, well, I should say the United States, we tend to think of everything south of the Rio Grande River as being just Mexico. You know, most people here don't know much about like Central America and especially South America. So, everything in the sort of south of the United States and Latin America must just all be Mexico. That's kind of an implicit assumption made by a lot of people. And so, of course, that's just very wrong. Latin America has a huge variety of different governments, politics, ethnic groups, economic conditions, geography, climate zones, just all of the variety of the world is in there in Mesoamerica and South America. Huge amount of diversity. And yeah, you definitely see that in the Falklands. Yeah, it's not quite perhaps the climate zone that one would expect of a Latin American country, but it is. Yeah, that whole southern cone, well, not quite the southern cone, but trying to remember what it was called. There's a region in the far south of Argentina, and it also kind of encompasses southern Chile, and it's sort of that subarctic area there. It's not the Pampas, it's south of the Pampas, and it's not nearly as fertile. It has a specific name, and I totally have forgotten it. I'm sure if we have any Argentines listening, they know right away what I'm talking about. But yeah, that was not really settled or even much claimed by Argentina until like the mid-late 1800s or so. It was very late in taking that land because it was just so inherently unattractive. Oh, I think I was about to Google it, but then I saw somebody in chat meant Patagonia. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that climate zone there is pretty much the same, or at least very similar to that in the Falklands Islands. Yeah, there's not, I mean, you mentioned the research stations, but there's not really much strategic value there unless you're looking to project. I'm talking about the Falklands Islands. There's not much strategic value in the islands unless you're looking to project power into South America, in which case, very strategically located. But Britain's always had kind of a weird relationship with Latin America. It was historically it was never a part of the British Empire, but in the 1800s it was kind of de facto in the British Empire. That mostly was something that occurred after independence. All of the Latin American countries, except for Brazil anyway, and maybe a handful of others, were originally a part of Spain. And in the early 1800s, there was a series of wars. I think that was the Bolivarian Revolution, if I'm not mistaken, where they almost all of them broke away from Spain and became independent countries. And when that happened, it was much easier for British merchants to gain access to those markets And they were sufficiently dominant that they became the principal investors in Latin America, or at least most of Latin America. And they were sufficiently commercially dominant in the region that, well, again, they were de facto considered part of the British Empire. There just wasn't any other European empire that had nearly as much influence. Argentina, in particular, benefited, somewhat ironically, given the topic of the conversation. Uh, British investment powered the industrialization of Argentina in the early 20th century, and they were able to achieve a pretty impressive rail network, much more so than their neighbors in South America, largely on the back of British investment. And for a while, Argentina was actually one of the wealthier countries in the world until stuff happened.
Stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a rough period in the 1930s. It was trying to remember what they called it. I was going to say La Violencia, but I think that's actually a Colombian thing that happened in the 40s or 50s, maybe. And that's slipping my mind too. Well, again, I'm sure if we have anybody from Argentina, they remember this. But yeah, there was a period of political and economic instability in the 1930s, and Argentina never really fully recovered from that. That was in particular where the military coups happened. And in general, the military and militarists in general in Argentina were very skeptical of British economic influence, and they were much more protectionist as a result. They wanted Argentine industry to develop so that the country could be self-sufficient, which is always the goal of, autarkist nationalists. And as a result, there was some distance achieved between Argentina and Britain in terms of their relationship that had been relatively close up to that point. There were still people that were for it. There were still liberals in Argentina that were relatively Anglophile. But because of the military coups, the protectionist nationalists generally got their way in terms of public policy. And of course, by the end of World War II, British commercial influence in Latin America had significantly declined because a certain other power had largely pushed them out, sometimes quite forcefully. That, of course, was the United States, which very much took advantage of the weak state of the British Empire after World War II to kind of expand its own influence. They were still allies. Everybody was worried about the Soviets after World War II, especially once the Cold War really got going. But that said, the United States, well, most of the United States anyway, most people in the United States, did not think particularly highly of the British Empire, even if they liked British people. And as a result, a lot of American foreign policy in the 10 years or so after World War II was very unfavorable to the maintenance of the British Empire. And, technically Latin America wasn't a part of the British Empire, but again, the United States was not thrilled at British influence in the region, which they largely saw as kind of their own backyard. Some of you may recall the Monroe Doctrine, wherein the United States basically forbid European powers from operating in the Western Hemisphere. But the United States, for most of its history, did not have the power to enforce that. We just didn't really have a navy powerful enough to really dissuade any but the weakest of European powers from meddling in the Western Hemisphere. So by and large, the Monroe Doctrine was enforced more by British acquiescence than it was by American deterrence. The
Well,
British had.
isn't the
Go ahead.
Monroe Doctrine technically just calling dibs?
It
Yo,
was an attempt.
Western
Yeah.
Hemisphere, USA, just saying, we call dibs. So if you could just let it be, that's our half. You get the Eastern Hemisphere.
Yeah. Yeah, it was kind of an attempt too. It was specifically, I think it was a response to the wars of independence in Latin America. There was a desire to protect those republics, and that was a genuine concern because there was real talk in Europe about trying to snuff out those liberal rebellions. Keep in mind, the Napoleonic Wars had only really ended, not too long before. I want to say, what was it, 1814, and then the Wars of Independence didn't really end until 1821. So there was considerable overlap there. And a lot of European monarchies who had basically won, their war against liberalism in so much as the Napoleonic Wars can be considered a monarchical war against liberalism. And afterwards, there was something of a I think they called it the Concert of Europe, but maybe that's the 17. I don't quite remember. But basically, there was a de facto alliance between the monarchies of Europe against liberalism, even at the same time that they were still nominally strategic rivals. All of them recognized a common interest in suppressing liberalism. And as a result, there was the idea floated that they should all cooperate to crush liberalism in Latin America in order to make sure that it didn't serve as some kind of springboard into Europe or what have you. So that didn't go anywhere, largely because the British would have had to have given their okay. You know, they ruled the ocean, having the most powerful navy at the time. And they were actually quite keen on the idea of Latin American republics maintaining their independence because, again, they derived significant commercial advantage from that. And so without British assistance, that imperial anti-liberal project never really went anywhere. But to kind of bring that full circle, that's the more important factor to how successful the Monroe Doctrine was. You know, it wasn't so much the United States as it was British self-interest, ensuring that other European powers did not try to shoe in on their commercial operations in the Western Hemisphere. Hypothetically, they could have conquered them themselves. The British certainly would have had enough power to do that, but that would have been a major undertaking. You know, you were just talking about how far away, you know, Argentina was from Britain. So it wasn't any less far away in the early 1800s. And really, the benefit from maintaining good relations in terms of good commercial relations ultimately was more beneficial than any potential benefit from outright conquering all that territory, which again would have been very expensive. So the cost benefit was just not in favor of empire building in Latin America. It just made more sense to trade as normal and to de facto monopolize that trade to the exclusion of European powers, other European powers. But yeah, the British commercial influence was significant through the 1800s, if not also the 1700s, although it was a little more restrained then. But certainly in the 1800s and the first half of the 20th century, British commercial interests were largely dominant. And again, that didn't change until the United States kind of pushed them out. You know, U.S. financial interests in Latin America did not really grow significantly until the very late 19th century and early 20th century. And Mexico was largely the first recipient, shall we say, of significant foreign investment. You know, the United States invested in Mexican rail construction and other commercial projects. I think oil was one of them as well. And then, of course, there was significant American investment in Cuba in the form of plantations and I guess what you would call now resorts. I don't know if they called them that at the time, but you know, hotels, recreation, that kind of thing, tourism, let's say. And then, of course, everybody knows about American investment in the plantations in Central America. Those were the famous banana plantations that resulted in a not inconsiderable amount of violence. Although, to be fair, a lot of that violence was kind of innate. They didn't so much cause the violence so much as they participated in it. Doesn't make them any less guilty, but technically there was already a significant amount of political violence in Central America. So they weren't entirely the cause of all that. But anyway, late 1800s, early 20th century, that was the principal, that was basically the extent of American investment in Latin America. And it didn't really expand much beyond that until like, I want to say 1930s, 1920s, 30s, and 40s. That's kind of when it really got going. And so by the end of World War II, the British were not, well, British finance was not in as strong a position to maintain commercial influence. And American finance kind of moved in to fill the gap. The Rio Treaty, which I'm always happy to plug since I did a whole podcast series on it, that was a institution created after World War II that was largely an expansion of institutions created during World War II. And those institutions during World War II involved a considerable amount of American financial aid to Latin America. And a lot of those commercial ties were maintained after the war. And that was largely to the detriment of British commercial ties to the region. and they never really quite recovered from that. In addition to just being economically despondent after the war, just because of the conditions they went through, America's push to try to improve economic ties in order to ensure Latin American loyalty to the Allied cause during the war served to significantly expand already expanding American financial influence to the point where they were basically dominant by the end of the war, and they've pretty much been dominant ever since. Probably up until maybe the past 10, 15 years or so, when Chinese finance started to kind of push into the region. Yeah, here and there I've been taking notes on examples of US-UK competition, which never really fully stopped until maybe sort of near the end of the Cold War. And it's taken on some interesting manifestations. I think one of them was the Anglo-American loan. I don't remember the year. I want to say it was like 1947 or something. But that was a loan that the British very much needed. The British economy, again, was not doing well after World War II. And austerity was very much the rule of the day. I'm sure everybody in Britain remembers austerity. That was definitely one of the dominant political issues through the 20 teens.
What is that?
Well, basically, austerity is just when the government either has to or feels that it has to cut its budget in order to prevent some kind of debt crisis, either in the short term or the long term. It can also be a response to a decline in the economy in order to make sure that in order to make sure that revenue and expenses stay balanced.
Mm-hmm.
In general, economists say that it's better to have fiscal expansion during an economic downturn, but historically there are examples of countries going against that. But anyway, more recently, in the 20 teens, there was a prolonged period, specifically after the 2008 financial crisis, in which the British economy wasn't doing too well, and there was a lot of concern once the British economy had kind of stabilized after the financial crisis about the extent of debt that had been run up. Not only directly in response to the financial crisis, but also just in general, the structural deficit that had been built up over time even before that. And the governments after that were pretty conservative. That was the Cameron government, I believe. And they implemented policies of austerity to cut social spending, as well as spending in general, in order to try to cut the deficit and cut down on debt. So that was a source of a great deal of political consternation in British politics over the past 10-some years. So it was no less so in the 1940s and 1950s, when similar austerity policies were implemented as a result of the immense amount of debt that had been run up over the course of the war. And paying for that debt was not very easy, because American exports kind of flooded into the newly opened free trade zone that it had de facto created in the regions that it had liberated/conquered over the course of the war. But anyway, British politics immediately after the war became much more, I guess, liberal. Liberal means something different in British politics, though. It means more like classically liberal. So I guess I should say pro-labor. There we go. So they famously voted out Winston Churchill, which he was a bit upset about, and voted in, what was his name? Attlee? Somebody in chat can probably remember this. I don't quite remember his name, but he was a Labour Prime Minister, and one of the things he had run on and wanted to do was to create what we now call the NHS, the National Health Service. And that, of course, is Britain's nationalized healthcare system. So in order to do that, he would have to spend a lot of money. And again, Britain's economy wasn't doing too well, so they didn't necessarily have that money. So they were invariably going to have to take out a major loan in order to, buy out all the hospitals, do all the nationalizations they needed to do, etc. And so they came to the United States, and they basically begged for this loan. They actually sent John Maynard Keynes to negotiate it. And Keynes was, confident that he had pretty good arguments, that it was a good idea, that it would help the economy to engage in this kind of fiscally expansionary policy. And the response in the United States was predictable. We basically said, that's stupid, we're not doing that. Why would we just give you all this money just so you can create the NHS? And eventually, the only way that the British were able to get the United States government to agree to lend this money uh, was by basically opening up British colonies to foreign trade. They had to agree to the convertibility of the pound, the lack of convertibility of which had been one of the policies by which the British had excluded other commercial actors besides British commercial actors from British colonies. So the convertibility of the pound and broader access to the economies of British colonies was basically the price they had to pay to set up the NHS. So that's one of the examples of the United States helping dismantle the British Empire immediately after World War II.
I guess the
So,
the main thing that I didn't get from a lot of this Falklands business was, I guess, the state of the British Empire when it was happening. That lead up wasn't really given at all, but I guess they were doing it from less a position of strength than it looked like from their results. They did
oh yeah,
relatively well.
oh yeah, yeah. They overperformed,
Yeah.
so to speak. Yeah, it was in retrospect, like you say, it's obvious that they would win, but at the time, they were exiting a period of malaise, and it wasn't entirely clear. There wasn't quite that same confidence that they would have later.
Hmm.
But it was definitely a feel-good victory for them, and it kind of defined the 80s, that sort of period of economic revival and confidence. To be fair to Argentina, it wasn't necessarily just a military dictator trying to maintain their popularity. I mean, that was definitely the driving feature. But one of the sort of underlying factors that produced that was the Latin American financial crises of the 1980s, the early 1980s. That happened, I want to say, largely as a result, well, partly as a result of the United States jerking up interest rates. That was when Paul Volcker was famously the head of the Federal Reserve, and he implemented what we would now call monetarist monetary policies, specifically that the United States Federal Reserve needed to focus on fighting inflation more than anything. And so he increased interest rates by something like 20 percentage points. It was a huge amount. And that created a minor recession in the economy. But the result was that inflation was finally brought under control after a long period of kind of running wild a little bit in the 1970s. So that helped stabilize the US economy, but for developing markets around the world, it was a minor disaster because when the United States increased interest rates, that created an incentive for investment portfolios to redistribute funds out of developing markets and into the United States. And so there was a giant outflow of investment money out of specifically Latin America, but also other developing markets as a result of that policy. And it had a pretty dire economic effect on a number of countries in the region because the result is that it costs more to borrow money. And a lot of them had racked up a significant amount of debt over the course of the 1960s and 70s as a result of what you would call import substitution development strategies. And the name basically tells you what it means. Basically, they wanted to try to develop their economies and specifically industry by creating protectionist barriers that made it more expensive to import stuff than to make that stuff in their own countries. And results were pretty mixed. The trouble on paper it seems like a good idea, but generally what happens is that political interests get involved in those industries that sort of flourish as a result of import substitution strategies. And they use that political power to basically protect themselves not only from foreign competition, but also domestic competition, to the point where there's never really an incentive to become efficient. And the result is that they never really become competitive globally and become a sort of running source of, well, that's not quite the phrase I want. Basically, they have to get subsidies from the government, continue to get subsidies from the government ad infinitum in order to maintain operations, in order to stay above water. And that's pretty much what happened in most of Latin America in the 70s and in the 60s and 70s. They significantly advanced their industry but it never really became competitive, and they had to run up significant debts in order to import all of the capital they needed to set up the industry, to import all of the raw resources they need, the ones that they couldn't get at home anyway. And eventually they just ran up so much debt that when interest rates ran up, well, that is to say, significantly increased, they couldn't really borrow more money. They were basically cut off. The interest rates were just too high to justify it. And so they had to significantly curtail expenditures on those industries, and the result was economic malaise through much of the 80s in Latin America. So Argentina was impacted like that, just like everybody else. And that was a significant factor in the deteriorating economic conditions in Argentina that led to the military becoming unpopular and feeling the need to do something as drastic as military adventurism in order to try to maintain their legitimacy.
So economic pressures, the military's in control. If the country's doing poorly, then the military is blamed for how the country's doing, even if it's external factors. So military has upset population. Military is good at doing military things. Let's go do some military shit over there. That's going to solve
Exactly.
it.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
No.
At least as I understand it. I would certainly welcome correction from anybody who's more familiar with the subject. I'm sure we have at least a few people in Latin America listening. Your input is valued. And I guess now would be as good a time as any to point out to provide the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, but it were otherwise. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, so I won't see anything you write right away. But I will see it later. So participation is encouraged. But yeah, people tend to blame their governments for economic conditions, regardless of whether or not those governments had anything to do with those conditions or even have anything that they could do to change those conditions.
Well, I need to blame somebody.
Yeah, that's part of the reason Trump probably lost the 2020 election. The COVID-19 thing kind of tanked everybody's economy. And incumbents all around the world kind of got blamed for it. Although management of COVID was also a factor. In a lot of countries, incumbents actually won re-election, even in spite of COVID, because polities gave them credit for successfully managing it. But in those countries where they were not given such credit, yeah, they definitely got full blame, not only for COVID, but also for the prevailing economic conditions. Yeah, I don't know if you guys, if you specifically, Neuro, remember, but like very early 2020, like January or so, Australia's government was just wickedly unpopular on account of the fires that were kind of burning out of control at the time. Do you recall this?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think his name was Scott Morrison, Prime Minister Morrison, and he was in power at the time, and he was getting blamed left and right by everyone and their mother, because he hadn't had, they alleged that he hadn't done enough about climate change and that the fires were largely a result of that, and it was his fault. And he went to Hawaii while the fires were burning on like a trip or a vacation or something, and so people were really mad about that. So it was just a very bad month for the Australian government in general.
That reminds me of Ted Cruz going to Cancun during the freeze in Texas.
Yeah.
Quick tip for the chat. If you're going to be a governor of a place or a prime minister and stuff goes sideways and you just take your vacation right then, some people will be mad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a good look. But after COVID hit, the Australian government took very strong actions in order to counter it. I guess famously so by this point. And Scott Morrison and his government were credited with that, to the point where there was almost a complete 180 in terms of the government's popularity. It's just from being very unpopular during the fires, to having very high approval ratings a couple months into COVID. And I don't think that's much changed since then. Even in spite of all the criticism the Australian government gets from outside Australia for those policies. Those COVID policies are very popular in Australia, and he's largely been credited with maintaining those policies. Was there anything else that kind of tickled your fancy? You mentioned more than one documentary, I think.
Mm-hmm. What's the other one? Oh, it was on Stockholm Syndrome. And the event that gave rise to the term Stockholm Syndrome, kind of what happened there and what it meant. So, I can give you the short version. Basically, this is a hostage situation that occurs in Stockholm, Sweden, at a time before most municipalities of police, whatever, were used to dealing with such a thing. Like, Sweden, it's got a relatively low population compared to a lot of the big countries. So for something of this magnitude to happen was something where you just don't have any experts on this situation in particular who are there. So everyone's kind of just showing up and then playing it by ear of trying to do something about it, but they're not quite sure exactly what should be done. So they rope in this psychologist to help try to analyze, like, why would the robber do this? They didn't just try to rob the bank, they took a bunch of the employees hostage and stuff and had a grenade or some such, basically lethal means for the hostages. And like, shit, well, we can't get him out of there, and this person's making these crazy demands of they want a Mustang like in a TV show and all this kind of stuff, and they want to free this other criminal from prison. And so they think they know who this person is who's inside the bank, but they're mistaken. They send in, and this is the psychologist's idea, everyone has a conscience, right? So what if we send in the robber's brother to make an appeal and say, hey, enough's enough, you should surrender to the police, mom and dad are watching, this is really bad what you're doing. So they send in this brother, and he's going down the stairs, and he's like, hey, it's me, I'm your brother, like, what's up? And he's about to round the corner, and they just like open fire and just shooting right at him. And he's like, what the fuck, what are you doing? It wasn't his brother. They had the wrong suspect. They just sent in someone's brother, but it wasn't the person who was there in the heist. So that whole appeal to emotion of, well, your family members would be disappointed in you. You have to send at least the right family members to even test that. So this psychologist person here is basically leading a hostage exchange, and they're not even the best psychologist. And they end up kind of saying that because these hostages were cooperating with the robbers, therefore they must have developed some emotional attachment to them and even turned sides and everything. So they made assumptions, and these assumptions are what we refer to as Stockholm Syndrome, which is not actually a syndrome listed in any manual of psychology that doctors would use today. It's more of something that is reported about in news media and in books and stuff, but it's not really a thing. They talked to these people who ended up being the hostages after, and they said, yeah, I was going along with him because I didn't want to fucking die. Oh, because we thought that you fell in love with them. No, I just didn't want to get shot. Oh, that's a different emotion than love. So it was kind of refreshing, and also a good reminder that a lot of terms like syndrome and things can be used fairly loosely, and if momentum with that gets going, they can just kind of make the assumption that, oh, this is an official medical thing, when in actuality it is not.
Yeah, it's a pretty good summary from what I remember of it. You know, who was the... Do you remember the principal example of Stockholm Syndrome in the United States?
No.
I think that was Hearst. Patty Hearst. That's who it was. Yeah. Have you ever heard of the Symbionese Liberation Army?
Symbionese? No.
Yeah.
What is that?
They were... I guess they were what you would call urban guerrillas. They were a radical left-wing group in the 1970s. There was more than a few running around the United States at the time, and they kidnapped Patty Hearst, whom I think, well, she was basically the daughter of a wealthy individual. I think she was in the Hearst family, like Rudolph Wandel. Well, basically the guy that was the newspaper mogul. I think she was like his granddaughter or something.
Hmm.
But anyway, she got kidnapped, and she ended up joining the group and becoming a member. So there was a lot of famous media coverage of that at the time.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's how Stockholm Syndrome kind of got popularized in the United States. I don't know that it was well known before that.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's a good number of urban guerrilla movements running around back in the 70s. Some in the 60s, but the 70s seem to have more of them. Have you ever heard of the Weather Underground?
The Weather Underground. No.
Yeah. Yeah, that was I guess you could call it a terrorist group. I don't think they ever killed anybody though. I'm sure somebody in chat knows because this group was kind of forgotten like in the 80s and 90s, but then it was kind of brought back into the limelight because the what was it? Barack Obama went to a church or something where one of the former members went or something like that. He had some kind of affiliation with them, and of course that affiliation was brought out into the news. Everybody was commenting on it and saying, "Oh, he has extremist links. He's gonna communize America, all this kind of thing." So there was much hemming and hawing over that. But yeah, they were a terrorist group. They set off some bombs. I think they attacked the Pentagon at one point. And yeah, they were one of several such groups in operation in the 1970s. What, Weather Underground, Symbionese Liberation Army. I guess some of the other prominent ones were some of the black nationalist ones, like the Black Panthers.
Hmm.
They were pretty well known at the time. And then to a lesser degree, you could point to the, what was it? Not the Muslim League, that's something else. Islamic Nation, Muslim Nation. Maybe chat can help me out with it. Basically, it was the group that Malcolm X was a part of.
Hmm.
Actually, this might be interesting to those of you maybe not familiar with U.S. history. Back in the 1950s and 60s, black nationalism kind of emerged or started to take off sort of parallel to the civil rights movement. And one of the movements that started off was an Islamic movement that wanted to better tie African Americans to their African heritage. And it was noted by this movement that a number of African Americans had originally come from countries that had predominantly Islamic populations. And so there was this idea that they had originally been Muslims but had been forcibly converted as slaves, and that if they wanted to embrace their heritage, then they should convert. And so, that was fairly popular amongst some communities. And so there was again, I'm struggling to remember the name. I'm going to have to look that up. But it attracted enough new members that it became a pretty significant movement in its own right. And black nationalism in particular became kind of tied up in it. Malcolm X was easily the most famous member. Nation of Islam, that's what it was. So that's a group that still exists, but I don't know that they're as relevant politically as they used to be back in the day. And so, some black nationalist groups, some of the more radical ones anyway, kind of spun out of groups like that, like Nation of Islam, as well as others. Yeah, there was this famous incident now. It didn't used to be famous, but it got to be famous in the past like 5 years. There was a Black Panther group that protested in Sacramento, the capital of California, and they were open carrying weapons when they were doing it, and that led to a big panic in Californian politics. And as a result, the conservative government, no less, introduced a bunch of gun control legislation because they were worried about extremists. To be fair, the Black Panthers were not the only extremists running around at that time, but certainly that protest in particular had an impact. Yeah, those are the main ones I'm remembering off the top of my head. I guess I'm focusing mostly on left-wing organizations since those were sort of the more active at the time, but there were definitely some far-right ones as well. Yeah, the far left ones were generally taken more seriously because they'd actually perpetrated a number of attacks on institutions like the Pentagon and the government, and there was sort of an implicit assumption, especially on the political right in the United States, that left-wing radicals were somehow working with the Soviet Union or the KGB or what have you. Basically, that they were communist insurrectionists in one sort or another. But yeah, there was some surge in far-right activity as well. I remember specifically reading that this is kind of the era when the KKK and the neo-Nazis started to work more together, which they hadn't really done before. Fascists and American racists have always had pretty significant overlap, but organizationally and historically speaking, they've kind of, well, were before the 70s anyway, kind of distinct threads. Racists, specifically the KKK and other far-right groups like that, were generally more conservative and traditionalist in the sense that they didn't really want a big government. They were generally pretty anti-state. Whereas neo-Nazis tended to be fascist, and of course fascists definitely do want a big state. They're just inherently statist. So that kind of acted as a divide between them, even if they had common goals. But in the 70s, they started to coalesce together a little bit. And that's kind of progressed with time. And there was one incident in particular when there were some union activists who were trying to help some workers at a textile factory in North Carolina, I want to say, unionize. And during a protest in which the union organizers were trying to get people to come out, there was some KKK / neo-Nazis basically came out and shot them to death. And the wild thing about that is that it was on camera. They weren't shy at all. They just kind of came up and gunned them down. Yeah, the footage is still around, I think, still circulating. But that was a particularly egregious example of far-right violence. Yeah, but I don't want to just exclude, I don't want to just focus on the United States. There was also a bunch of radical urban guerrillas in Latin America as well. And that was actually one of the reasons there was such a major crackdown in the 1970s in Latin America. A number of far-left radical groups kind of took up arms. And that combined with deteriorating economic conditions, mostly owing more to the energy crisis in the 60s and 70s, well, 70s, I should say, that spurred a lot of concern amongst conservatives in Latin America about the allegedly rising threat from these urban guerrillas. And so that partly was used to justify this, that, or the other military coup. I think Uruguay in particular was an example of that. Argentina as well. Chile kind of had its own thing going on. But in terms of Argentina and Uruguay and maybe some others, I think those were the main ones in the 70s that had coups. Yeah, the urban guerrillas were definitely a factor. Brazil had already had a military coup in 1965, so it was kind of irrelevant for them. I don't think they had the same phenomena. And then Europe also had a whole bunch. Germany had Red Army faction. I think that was also called the Baader-Meinhof gang, rather. There was actually a movie made about them back in the aughts. And then there was in Italy the Red Brigades. And then I don't know that France had any. I think France just had a really active communist party. They didn't really have to engage in extremism there. They were sufficiently political powerful to not need it. But then in, I think, Spain and maybe southern France, there was the Basque separatists. That was kind of more nationalist than it was far left, though. But they were pretty active. And then there was the Troubles in the UK, specifically in Northern Ireland. Japan was pretty quiet. I don't think I remember, although the Japanese Communist Party was very powerful in the 1950s. Declined pretty rapidly after that, though, from what I was hearing. So I don't know that Japan really had to worry about paramilitary groups much in the 70s. Hong Kong did. Hong Kong had a significant series of protests in the 60s and 70s. Those were generally left-wing in nature, but I don't know that they involved a great deal of violence per se. And I don't know about Australia. Maybe any Australians in chat can tell me what was going on in the 70s, if there was any radicalism of any note. I think those are all the ones I remember. Yeah, mostly that's obviously the Western world. Obviously, the Eastern world probably had its own equivalents. But yeah, a not insignificant amount of extremism at the time. It's definitely cooled off considerably since then. Yeah, if you ever think that maybe the world's spiraling out of control and that we're all in a lot of trouble, just keep in mind that it's still not as bad now as it was in the 60s and 70s. We still haven't reached that threshold yet.
Relatively chaotic times.
Yeah. I think uncertainty is more the defining trait right now, much more so than instability or violence or what have you. Let's see. We did have a couple questions, but did you have anything else you wanted to kind of get to?
Nothing in particular.
Okay. So somebody was asking for a Brexit update. How is the EU doing? Was Brexit a good move in hindsight? So I think the update on Brexit is that there was some agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, or the Irish Protocol. Actually, the technical name slips my mind. But basically, there was some drama about a protocol in which the UK was supposed to implement border checks, specifically like regulatory checks, tariffs, what have you, on goods leaving mainland UK and going to Northern Ireland. And that's been very controversial in the UK ever since it was agreed to. So the Johnson government was making noise about potentially suspending it, which technically they could do. You know, there is a clause in the agreement they signed with the European Union that would allow them to do that if the protocol was sufficiently disruptive to trade between the UK and Northern Ireland. But I think they ended up backing down not too long ago. So I think that's more or less been resolved. Yeah, I don't think there's been much else going on in terms of Brexit. I'm sure there will be. There's hellbound to be plenty more disagreements. I know there's been a lot of drama about fishing, for example. But fishing isn't a very sexy political issue. So
It is if you're a fish.
Oh yeah, if you're a fish, you'll care a lot about that, but everybody else not so much. But yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth on that. It just hasn't really been much newsworthy. So yeah, fishing, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that's pretty much it. I would expect there's probably going to be more drama maybe next year over things like subsidies, because there's just a lot of things like subsidies and tariffs and whatnot that were not entirely hashed out in the original Brexit agreement that was finalized at the end of 2020. And basically, you know, we've kind of talked a little bit about this before, but basically they agreed to create a whole bunch of commissions, and each of those commissions would have responsible for adjudicating disputes between the UK and the EU as far as the implementation of the Brexit agreement. But the trouble with the Brexit agreement is that it's sufficiently ambiguous that there's invariably going to be disputes, which means that agreements that should have been made during the negotiation of the actual agreement are instead going to be hashed out in these commissions over the course of disagreements that arise in the future. So that's definitely going to play out at some point. I just don't know when. But for now, things are relatively quiet. I think everybody, I think Europe and the UK really wanted to take some time away from Brexit and focus on other stuff. So policy issues there have not really been paramount for either party. And as a result, the news has been relatively slow on that front.
Mm.
But the EU, let's see, part of the question is how is the EU doing? They're doing fine. One of the things that the UK had to do after the Brexit agreement was agreed to and implemented is that they had to basically implement border checks on stuff going out of the UK into the European Union, as they agreed to do in the agreement. But they did not have the administrative capacity to do the same for European goods coming into the UK. So as a result, the agreement has not actually been enforced entirely. And very much to the advantage of European producers who basically don't have any of the regulatory checks or tariffs for goods going into the UK that their British compatriots have to face for goods coming into the European Union. So for the EU, there hasn't really been all that much disruption. But for British producers who have traditionally exported into the EU, they've faced a lot of disruption. And again, the fishermen kind of got the bulk of that. The regulatory checks on fish and other seafood that the British had traditionally exported into the EU were sufficiently delaying export of the seafood that a lot of it would just go bad before it could reach the consumers. And as a result, regulatory checks alone basically destroyed British seafood exports into the EU. I don't think that was ever resolved. So, that's just a market that's basically denied to them. There are probably similar examples in other industries. I think generally food-based, owing to the perishable nature of food exports. But I don't know how disruptive it was for say, the services sector, for example, or for the manufacturing sector. I know there was some disruption. There was some announcements by large corporations that they would relocate to the European Union out of the UK, or that they would build this, that, or the other investment in Europe instead of the UK, owing to certain changes to the regulatory landscape. But I don't know that there was a whole lot of those. It wasn't as traumatic as some people were expecting it might be. So yeah, I think the primary sector, food in particular and other natural resources kind of bore the brunt of the disruptions from Brexit. But yeah, for now, I would say the European Union is doing fine. I don't think they've been put out too much by it. Let's see. And the final part of the question was Brexit a good move in hindsight? The trouble with that question is that it's very subjective. Economically, I don't think it's been very good for the UK. But, that's pretty much what everybody was predicting from the start. People were saying that it was going to be economically disruptive in a very negative way before even the vote on Brexit happened. And they pretty much said it, every month ever after, right up to the present day. And I think by and large, they've been right. I mean, I don't know what economic gain the UK can really say it's gained from it. I'm sure some industries have gained by way of disruption to competition, but beyond that, I don't think it's been an overall net gain. Maybe in the long term, they'll gain if they can kind of, like some Brexiteers want to do, they could deregulate their economy and be a sort of low-cost mecca for manufacturers exporting into the surrounding region. But I don't know if the EU would really even allow that to happen. They might jerk up tariffs and whatnot in order to prevent low-cost British goods from even entering the continent in the first place. So that plan may not be efficacious in the long run. But hypothetically, that is something that they could do. And if they did and it succeeded, you could call that an economic gain from Brexit. But in the short to medium term, the costs to adjusting to the new equilibrium is going to be pretty large. And I don't know that there's enough gain to really offset that. But beyond economic changes, a lot of Brexit was really more political than economic. I noticed that in the campaigning for Brexit, a lot of the focus was on gaining control of things like immigration, curtailing the power of the European Union's judiciary, to impact and limit the discretionary power of the British government. Stuff like that, sovereignty issues, basically, I think were more important. So, in so much as those issues were important, I would say people are probably satisfied, because certainly the British government has repatriated a significant amount of power from the European Union. Uh, Maybe not as much as they might like. I think they've had to uh, accept that there's still going to be some power that the European Court of Justice has over British regulations owing to the terms of the Brexit agreement that was signed. So they're not completely free and clear. And I think what they'll find is that the free trade agreements that they sign with other parties in the future are probably similarly going to restrict freedom of action. If not because their counterparty demands it, then at the very least because the European Union pressures the counterparty into demanding it. Yeah, I think the British are going to find the European Union to be something of a trade rival going forward, in so much as the European Union has an interest in ensuring that the UK doesn't just flood the European market with cheap stuff by way of either the existing trade deal that they signed with the EU or just by way of smuggling. If they did, it wouldn't be the first time in history Britain had been a kind of pirate trader. But it's been a couple hundred years since the last time.
Privateers.
Yeah, privateers.
People who do sanctioned piracy on behalf of the crown.
Yeah, as I've studied the 1600s, I found it interesting that the British were much better at piracy than they were at trading. That's kind of, I would have expected them to be like dominant traders at the time, but actually the Dutch kind of ate their lunch. The Dutch commercial empire in the 1600s was just dominant, utterly. And really, it's only because, at least as of my reading right now, from my understanding, the only reason the British were able to become more dominant traders is because the Dutch were just so successful in the 1600s that they kind of got lazy. They got complacent. And they implemented a bunch of rules that were designed to exploit the monopoly that they enjoyed in East Asia. But the result of those rules is that they pushed a lot of trade into British-controlled ports to the benefit of British merchants. Yeah, the British kind of were in a race with the Dutch to gain control of Spice Islands in East Asia, as well as to gain control of sort of key trading ports in South Asia. And by and large, the Dutch kind of won all those races. They were easily the far and away winners of that race. And the result of that is that the British kind of got second place and had to satisfy themselves with a lot of Indian ports that didn't specialize in spices and whatnot. And they also had to kind of open up their ports to free trade in order to try to get as much trade as they could. Well, that is to say, get as much revenue from taxing the trade as they could. But because they adopted a free trade policy, they ended up winning out over the long term, because a lot of the guys that didn't like the terms by which they had to trade in Dutch territory, which could be onerous on account of the monopoly, a lot of those guys switched over to British ports as a result. And the British Empire was able to benefit disproportionately over the long term, such that in the 1700s, they were able pretty much to leapfrog the Dutch and become the dominant traders in East Asia. And of course, that eventually led into them becoming the dominant traders globally in general. Anyway, that's something of a tangent. Not even sure how I got onto that. Yeah, was Brexit a good move in hindsight? It depends on your politics. If you're pro-Brexit, then you're probably mostly satisfied. Although you may not like some of the things that that London had to give away as part of the Brexit agreement. But if you were never pro-Brexit, then you're probably not any more set. Probably not any less angry and upset about it than you were before the Brexit agreement was signed. Let's see. So the next question was China and Taiwan update. I don't think anything new is out. We talked about it, what, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, whenever the last time was.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I don't think anything new has happened since then. Well, China is still buzzing Taiwan's airspace. They still send aircraft over in order to try to force the Taiwanese Air Force to scramble. And that's allegedly that's meant to exhaust the Taiwanese, but I think it's also a signal to the United States. And then there was also some more naval shenanigans around Japan. There was, I think, two separate flotillas of ships that were mixed in nature. They were both Russian and Chinese naval vessels. I guess I should just say ships, navy ships. And both one flotilla went through that strait in the north that separates Kyushu from Honshu, and then another one at the same time sailed through the strait separating Honshu from Hokkaido, other way around. In the north, it was the strait separating Honshu and Hokkaido. In the south, it was the strait separating Honshu and Kyushu. So that was just a little bit of flexing on the part of the Russians and Chinese. To reiterate what I said last week, because they did something similar in the northern strait a couple weeks ago, all of that is legal. It's not like they just sailed through Japanese waters and dared them to start a war. It's actually quite legal for naval vessels to sail through those straits. Kind of like it's more or less legal for ships to warships. I guess that's the word I was looking for. It's legal for warships to sail through the Bosphorus Straits, basically around Istanbul, so long as they meet certain conditions. So kind of same deal over there in Japan. But the fact that they thought to do it in the first place, that is to say, sail warships through those straits, kind of shows a certain degree of confrontational diplomacy taking place there.
It's an aggressive posture.
Yeah.
Anyone who's played a Civ game knows this. If you just park your army right next to somebody else, they're going to be like, hey, what are you doing there?
Yeah, some of the newer ones, I think, they have that feature. I don't think it used to be. I remember back in Civ 3, if you had a weaker military than the other players, then the computer would just walk through your territory. Yeah, that's not something. It's something they did away with in later versions. Like in later versions, other players cannot walk through your territory unless you give them explicit permission. But in Civ 3, there was nothing stopping them. They could just totally just do that. And if you ever did it to them, then the computer would get really angry with you, and your relations would take a hit, and they may even declare war. But if they did it to you, there wasn't really much you could do without also, instigating a conflict. You could tell them to leave, and maybe they would, but if you pressed the issue too many times, then that could lead to a conflict. So that could be a little frustrating if you're trying to, say, block a computer player's expansion into a bit of territory that you don't want them in. They'll totally just walk settler units right through your territory to get to wherever they want it. So that could lead to some games. Because unlike in later games, enemy units could not just pass through your units. You could actually block their advance if you had 3 units, basically, to whichever side you were trying to block them off of. So you could send 3 units to stop a settler moving through your territory from moving forward. And of course, every turn they would try to get around you, and you would have to move your units correspondingly, and that would just kind of be an ongoing game between you and the computer player to try to stop them from moving through your territory without telling them not to and causing a war anyway. But yeah, border tension is a thing. And that's kind of in play in Taiwan. But like I said last week, I don't think much will come of it. The Chinese government kind of has its own problems right now. I think they're mostly focused on dealing with economic issues. I think everybody's heard about Evergrande at this point, so they're trying to deal with the fallout from that.
What's Evergrande?
Evergrande is a real estate company, and it's one of the, I want to say it's one of the largest in the world, but they pretty much just operate in China. And they've racked up a massive amount of debt speculating in real estate to the point where there's some concern that if they fail to pay off their debt, if they default on it, then maybe there could be unforeseen ramifications for China's financial sector. Specifically, they're worried about contagion. They're worried that maybe there are links that are unseen in the financial sector between Evergrande debt and other financial institutions like localities, investors, what have you. that could cause a chain reaction of defaults that result in a financial panic, if not a general economic crisis. And the reason that's a possibility is because shadow banking is a big deal in China. Even after the Chinese government has tried to tamp down on it. And what I mean by shadow banking is I mean that there's a large informal sector in China's economy that is dedicated to just channeling investment. If you have money and you want to invest it, historically speaking, you have not been able to find good investment opportunities going through the formal financial sector. That is to say, investment banks and whatnot. Generally, there are better opportunities with informal banks that operate sort of under the radar, that kind of do not operate under the watchful eye of regulators. And if you're willing to take the risk of operating with what amounts to a underground bank, which inherently means that you're, at the risk of losing all of your money because you can't really take them to court per se. If you're willing to take that risk, you can generally get higher returns. And as a result, there's an immense amount of money that has been invested in that informal sector to the point where regulators in China are not really sure where all of that money is or how all of that money links together in terms of risk. And yeah, systemic risk is basically unobservable in much of China's financial sector. And so, the Chinese government knows that, and they've been going out of their way for the past 10 some years, trying to basically get money out of the informal sector and into the formal financial sector. And, they've had various tricks and means and policy levers they've used to do that. But it's still enough of a problem that Evergrande's debt is still seen as a potential threat. In a formal sector, we would see where all of that debt is, or at least most of it, and we would be able to roughly gauge how much risk there was and be able to take action on that. But in China, regulators can't really do that fully. And so they're very carefully trying to manage Evergrande's financial crisis here, their debt crisis. And, they don't want to entirely just bail them out, which they could do. They do want to have some penalty there so as to avoid moral hazard. In the future, everybody may just assume that they'll get bailed out if they engage in risky economic activity. So the Chinese government doesn't want that happening, obviously. So they're trying to figure out who's going to take the hit in order to avoid the moral hazard, while at the same time trying to make sure that the unwinding of Evergrande's debt does not happen so wildly and unpredictably as to cascade through China's informal financial sector, potentially causing a crisis. That's a rough description of the Evergrande issue. And as you can see, it's a little bit complicated, but basically that's the gist of it.
Wouldn't they be able to fix shadow banking if they just made their banks better than the shadow banks?
Yes, but the trouble there is that the financial sector, the formal financial sector, is subject to a lot of regulations that the government has in place in order to make sure that they don't engage in risky lending. And those restrictions are sufficiently restrictive that there's almost no way for a formal bank to offer investments that are sufficiently attractive, that they would be more attractive than the informal financial sector, which has no restrictions. They can engage in as much risky lending as they want. So one of the big problems is that the Chinese government has been trying to deal with a separate issue, which is the runaway cost of housing. Housing costs in China are just very high, especially in some of the tier 1 cities like Beijing or Shanghai or what have you. And also over the past 10 years, the Chinese government has been taking measures to try to restrict the growth in the cost of housing in order to make sure that housing is accessible to the broader part of the population. And, pretty much the same deal. They have this, that, or the other policy lever that they've had to do that. But one of the policy levers has been to restrict access to liquidity to real estate firms, basically. And, the result of that is that formal financial sectors, institutions, basically formal banks, just can't lend to, cannot invest as much as they would like to into the real estate sector. But again, informal banks can do that. Informal financial institutions have no such restrictions. Now, the reason this is all relevant is because one of the fastest growing investments you can make, it's not one of the fastest growing sectors, is the real estate sector in China. And as a result, one of the best returns you can get on an investment is an investment in real estate. So there's a lot of demand for real estate investment, but formal banks, owing to regulation, cannot provide that. Only the informal banks can do that. And so that's resulted in the formal financial sector struggling to compete.
Hmm.
So that's why they can't just get better. There are regulatory blocks there. Uh, there are other investments besides real estate that, investment banks can invest in, and they are doing that. But right now, it's just much more attractive to investors to do informal stuff. And certainly the Chinese government doesn't like that because they would rather have all of this money being dumped into real estate, which is inflating housing prices. They would rather have that money being dumped into things like the semiconductor industry or, just industry in general, because that obviously generates jobs, improves the Chinese economy's competitiveness, helps them become more self-sufficient, etc. The benefits are obvious. But as is, that money is not being channeled in that direction because the rate of return in the real estate sector is higher, and because the Chinese administration is not sufficiently strong to stop people from investing in those sectors. There's any number of ways that these sort of underground firms, underground lenders, and investors are able to circumvent the regulatory state and get investor dollars into real estate, whether the Chinese government wants it or not. And again, that's just part of the challenge of shadow banking. Like they could just shut the whole thing down. They could just say, okay, you can't invest in any housing and just take a very draconian approach. But then the trouble there is that the money is going to end up going into other things, basically, that they don't know. I mean, the whole problem with China's financial sector is that it is not sufficiently mature to handle all the trillions of dollars of savings that exist in China. And those savings need investment or want investment. The people who own those savings want to invest that money to get a return. And for them, they already operate in a relatively high risk economy because they don't really have rule of law. Like the judicial system is not really a reliable arbiter of disputes. And so, given the tolerance of risk, investing in something like the shadow banking sector is not that big a deal. All the more so because, like just about everything else in China, people invest based off of guanxi. They based off of the networks of people that they know. So, you're not just going to go out and invest in like some random thing that a guy on the street says that, hey, I'll invest this money for you. No, it doesn't work like that. Rather, you'll have a friend of a friend who says that they know a guy who is going to invest in a project. And hey, if you want to invest too and benefit from it, you can send their money and your friend will vouch for them so that such that it's safe.
Yeah, so
That's
you're
how,
basically, instead of operating from like vetted institutions with a reputation, you're using the reputation of people in your immediate social network to get you a connection to one that they would tell
exactly,
you is good.
exactly.
Right. So it's probably less spooky than it sounds initially, like shadow banking, or we're talking to mobsters here. It's just talking to people who don't want to hassle with all the regulations that the government wants to impose on them.
Pretty much. But that's not to say that organized crime is not involved.
True.
Invariably, whenever there's no regulation, they generally exploit it.
Hmm.
But yeah, you're right. There's also a lot of what you might call legitimate informal activity occurring as well. But yeah, people get scammed too. I mean, there's plenty of people who have lost money in the informal sector. I remember there was like a brief period where there was an app going around in which you could basically just uh, almost crowdsource funding, basically. And that got to be very popular for a while until it was just ruthlessly exploited, basically destroying the app's reputation. Lots of people put up fake investment projects that took up money and then just bailed, just disappeared. That's what happens in a lot of cases where the informal loans end up being scams. People will just disappear. Because the networks involved are relatively informal, because it's like friend of a friend, it can be hard sometimes to know who's actually getting the money and lending it. And those people, if they want to scam people, are pretty proficient at hiding their identity such that they can disappear.
Mm.
So that's just an inherent risk of dealing with an unregulated space like that. There's not really any way around it in a lot of cases. People who live in developing countries are kind of used to this. If they don't have like a strong, if they don't have strong rule of law, like an impartial judiciary, or if they have predatory public officials, uh, this kind of environment is very familiar to them, I would imagine. But yeah, that's dealing with the shadow banking sector and real estate. And also the trade war, that's had an impact as well. The Chinese government is really trying to push national champions, so to speak, state industries, as well as private industries with strong ties to the state, to try to make up shortfalls in areas that the Chinese government wants to be self-sufficient in, but is not yet so. Semiconductors are a prime example of that. So they're trying to push money into those sectors, while at the same time they're trying to discipline state-owned enterprises. So this is a separate economic issue. There's been a shift towards state-owned enterprises, basically in public policy in China, since Xi Jinping has come to power. He's part of a cohort within the Communist Party of China that believes that the party's authority, as well as just the national well-being, is best served by having strong state-owned companies. And they're in direct opposition to the liberals in the party, who believe that introducing as much competition as possible and creating distance between companies in the state is the best way to ensure efficient companies as well as economic development. So Xi Jinping and his statist faction are very much in the ascendancy. And as a result, there's a lot more resources being directed to them, although I would add the caveat that liberals have not been completely excluded from that policymaking process, to the point that while state-owned enterprises are being treated with more favor at this point, they're also receiving more, they're also being pushed to become more competitive. And in that sense, some of them are, well, two things. Some of them are being cut off from funding, and if they are found to be sufficiently inefficient. And then some of them are also being introduced to more foreign competition. So I think state-owned banks in particular are being pushed to kind of help modernize the financial sector, so that it can help pull more money out of the informal financial sector. And one of the ways they're doing that is introducing more, basically allowing more foreign operators to operate in China's financial market. That's kind of partly meant as an incentive and inducement to Chinese financial actors to become more efficient. They're also allowing more foreign automotives to enter China at a lower tariff. And the idea there is to encourage Chinese automakers to become more efficient. Many of those are either state-owned or significantly state-supported. So this change in how state-owned enterprises are being treated is also taking up some political bandwidth in Beijing. So all of these are basically major issues in China that the party is having to deal with. And so given the stakes of the success of those, various operations, if all of these were to fail, there would be like a financial crisis. China would be unable to get the resources it needs to kind of survive the trade war with the United States in the long term. And then also the state-owned enterprises would potentially collapse and cause a financial crisis of their own, or become so inefficient that they would be such a net drain on resources that the government wouldn't have the bandwidth, the financial bandwidth, to do other things. There are dire consequences if they screw up these various issues. So Taiwan, then, relatively speaking, is not like high on the agenda. It's not like a big priority compared to this other stuff. The economic issues are existential. Taiwan is just a peripheral thing. It's just more for decoration. If the Chinese government, Xi Jinping in particular, if he could reunify Taiwan with mainland China, obviously that's a huge feather in his cap, and he would get a lot of credit for that. But it also comes with some huge risks, and there's already so many risks within China's own domestic economy and politics that I have a hard time believing that the cost-benefit favors an aggressive policy there vis-a-vis Taiwan. So for these reasons, I don't think China is going to do anything on Taiwan. I think it's mostly just for show. I think it's mostly just to challenge the Biden administration, and in order to kind of feel out how strong the U.S. commitment is to the island. The party is nothing if not opportunist. If the United States does nothing and basically sends signals that it's not going to defend Taiwan, then maybe the cost benefit does favor taking action. But as is, the United States has sent some relatively strong signals that it's not going to do nothing. So long as that's the case, I think the cost benefit is sufficiently in favor of doing nothing that the Chinese government will restrain itself just to symbolic actions. Ooh. Could I take like a brief break to get some water?
Go get it, man. If there's ever a day where I don't let him take a water break, I want you to slap me, chat. That's when I know I've lost my way.
Thank you, sir. I'll be right back.
Take your time. Hey, can I get some water? No! But then I'll die. Oh. Really? Yeah. Well, we can't have that. Who here likes this, like, mass mind drop style? It's pretty funny. Pretty funny strat. Let's make sure I have the watchtowers. Looks like they're gonna do it again. I need heck and hydra speed. That's part of my problem here. And if I just split the hydras up a little bit, I might be able to defend. You think this is good? Glad you're enjoying it. We've had some interesting games today. While we talk about the world. How silly would it be to Tobro Aspire and pretend to be a Terran/Zerg air harasser? Do you mean going one base Spire? Two base Muta is a build. One base Muta is more of a meme build, but it has been done before. The main downside of one base Muta is you can only afford like 5 Mutas, which is a pretty small amount. An assessment you can make is, what can each Mutaflock size accomplish?
Thank you for your patience.
No problem.
Okay. Let's see, that's the China and Taiwan update. The third question we had here, since we talked about the Falklands War, would you mind talking about Operation Condor? So are you familiar with this, Neuro?
No. Operation
Oh, really?
Condor.
Oh boy, you're in for a treat.
It might ring a bell. We'll see.
Let's see, so Operation Condor happened in the 1970s. I want to say it was like the early mid-70s. And Operation Condor was a CIA operation in Latin America, I think mainly South America, especially the Southern Cone region. And the idea there was for the CIA to cooperate with local intelligence agencies and local governments in order to root out left-wing radicals of one sort or another. And the criticism of Operation Condor has been, well, for one, that the United States was cooperating with, violent authoritarian governments, which were generally military juntas. So the fact that we were de facto helping these countries repress their own populations is the big criticism. And if you've ever followed, Latin American politics, specifically the politics in the 1970s, you know how violent some of these military governments were. I mean, torture was not uncommon. In fact, it was routine in a lot of cases. Uruguay, in particular, much to my surprise, had a particularly violent military junta in power. Uruguay is a pretty chill country. I mean, they used to be known in the early 20th century as the Switzerland of South America. So I would not have thought that they would have a violent military junta in charge for as long as they did, or that it was as violent as what they had. To give you an idea of just what made Uruguay's military junta so much worse, other juntas would basically find people they suspected of either being extremists or of knowing extremists, and they would detain them, torture them, sometimes kill them, depending, and pump them for information. And in Uruguay's case, that wasn't really sufficient for them. For them, they wanted to send a message, and so what they would do is that they would detain people after they'd interrogated them anyway. They would detain them in mental health facilities and they would isolate them for years at a time. And, given what we know about isolation and the effects on, the human brain, that's very traumatic, especially the longer it goes on. And so in Uruguay's case, there was a number of examples of dissidents who were imprisoned in this way and just basically had their minds destroyed. And they were just never the same. Even the ones that survived. There was obviously a number who were killed over the course of the junta's reign. Even the ones that survived did not come out very well. So even Uruguay suffered sort of the same experience, but also Argentina, Brazil, Chile, maybe Paraguay. I'm not sure about Paraguay. It's kind of how I would have to characterize a lot of things with regard to Paraguay. I'm not sure. It's so quiet. Probably Peru as well. Peru and Bolivia, I don't hear about as much in terms of Operation Condor, but I'd be surprised if they weren't involved to some degree. But anyway, one criticism is that the United States was working with authoritarian countries and basically just helping them be authoritarian, engage in what was a lot of extremely violent. You didn't actually have to be a violent extremist to be detained. They suspected left-wing activists in general of being involved with radical activity. And as a result, they cast a very wide net. So, they would get people who were like civil rights activists, union activists, student activists, a lot of people who were just engaging in what in the United States you would call civil society. Those people were targeted very explicitly. I've even heard some people talk about politicide, the idea that they were trying to exterminate an entire political group within the regional politics. I think that's a little dramatic. I don't think they were going that far, but certainly they were going out of their way to target people that they thought were being publicly activist or publicly leftist, beyond a certain threshold anyway. And I would tie this back also to the conversation we were having earlier about radicalism, when I was basically just listing different radical groups. In the 70s, there was a notable urban guerrilla movement in a number of South American nations. So when Latin American countries, specifically the military juntas, said that there was a terrorist threat and they had to take action, they're exaggerating a bit, but it's not completely unfounded. There actually was violent extremism happening. That's not to say it justifies a military coup per se, or any of the number of other things that they did, but they weren't making it up. There was significant political violence happening. So that was I was trying to get to another point too. I don't quite remember it. I mean, the United States would send CIA agents, and they would basically train people how to interrogate detainees, teach them how to run detainee facilities, all this kind of thing. So the CIA definitely got their hands dirty at the time. Oh, that's going to bug me. I'm trying to remember that other point. Anyway, that's the gist of it. That's basically what Operation Condor was.
Yeah, anytime they've been trying to torture people, terrorize them, brainwash them, The experiments never really seem to go well. Someone always gets the bad end of that.
Yeah. I guess it might be worth mentioning too that this was associated at the time with Henry Kissinger,
Oh, yeah.
who is sort of America's premier realpolitik practitioner. He was Secretary of State, meaning he was basically in charge of America's foreign policy. He was not in charge of the CIA, so I don't know how much input he necessarily had in Operation Condor. But certainly he was not opposed to it. He was well known for believing that the United States should be very forceful in containing communism, not only around the world, but especially in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah, the Nixon administration got a lot of heat for CIA activity in Latin America during the church hearings. That was definitely a big deal at the time. This was after the Vietnam War when Democrats had control of, I think, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So there was a bunch of hearings both after the Vietnam War ended and I think also after the Nixon had resigned. And so there was a lot of questions about just what kind of activity the government had been up to. And so a lot of nefarious CIA activity came to light over the course of the hearings. And I think over the course of the Carter administration, afterwards, there was a number of restrictions placed on the CIA. I think that was where the famous ban on assassination was first implemented.
Assassination was okay before?
Oh, yeah, they were trying to assassinate Castro left and right.
Oh.
That was super common in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, I'm sure there was other people they also went after. Yeah, you can think of Operation Condor as being a kind of corollary to Operation Phoenix. I think that's what it was called. Phoenix Force, maybe that was it. Basically, during the Vietnam War, there was a period where the CIA, as well as probably also special forces units of one sort or another, probably Green Beret, coordinated with South Vietnamese intelligence agencies and security forces to crack down and root out not only NVA units and Viet Cong units, but also alleged sympathizers. And kind of similar to Condor, they cast a pretty wide net. You didn't necessarily have to be directly involved yourself. It was enough just to be suspected of involvement or even to be related or associated with somebody who was suspected of involvement. And those people would be detained, tortured, and not uncommonly killed. So the CIA also got its hands plenty dirty in Vietnam, but Condor pretty similar in the way it was done. I don't know that the CIA was as directly involved as it was in Vietnam, but yeah, certainly very strong similarities there. Yeah, one
Hmm?
governments in Latin America, huh?
You cut out for like 4 seconds.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that the CIA's involvement in Latin America kind of came back to bite them in the ass. Uh, there was a famous bombing. I don't know if I've talked about this before, but Chile's intelligence agency was Dino, something like that. I don't quite recall the acronym. But basically, they had a dissident they wanted to murder. The trouble being that the dissident in question was located in Washington, D.C. Now, normally, that would mean that the dissident was off limits, but in this case, they actually put a bomb in his car, which exploded, killing the individual in question. And of course, the government, the US government got involved and, investigated it. And when they found out that it was the Chilean intelligence agency, they were very upset because there was kind of an implicit norm that you don't conduct intelligence operations like that in the United States. So that was just part of a general turn, not only among the public, but also amongst government institutions away from the juntas. That's not to say they didn't stop supporting them, just that things like Operation Condor and whatnot were not quite as common afterwards. There was generally a sense that some of these governments were liabilities rather than assets. Yeah, I think a case in point maybe would be like Reagan putting pressure on some of the Central American governments to be a little less violent. They were extremely violent in El Salvador, Guatemala, whatnot. So there was some human rights pressure applied there. In general, the Reagan administration is known for putting a lot of support behind those governments, and that's definitely true. But the Reagan administration kind of took a cue from the Carter administration and did incorporate human rights a little more than the Nixon administration had into their foreign policy. To the point where they were able to get the general in charge of El Salvador in the early 80s to resign after it came out that he had a secret torture dungeon under his house. That was a bit too much even for the El Salvadoran military.
We can't be friends with him. Why? He has a dungeon. Lots of people have dungeons. It's a torture dungeon. A torture dungeon? A secret torture dungeon. Oh, that is right out. Yeah, you're right. We can't be his friend anymore.
Yeah, it didn't help that he was into the occult as well. Very strange stuff. Weirdly enough, that's actually not even the first time a military, well, obviously military, that's not even the first time a general in charge of El Salvador was found to be involved in the occult. That actually had also happened in the 1930s, weirdly enough. Seems to be a thing down there.
Which brand of occult stuff? Which is
Catholic, Christian, Catholic, occult type stuff.
Catholic occult stuff?
Oh yeah, there's always like weird fringe groups, fringe religious groups that kind of go off on their own and kind of mix traditional Christianity with occult type rituals and violence and all manner of weird shit.
Well, like when people are bringing back Knights Templar and doing things in that kind of name.
Kind of like that, yeah. I think in El Salvador's case, they mixed it more with like local traditions, local culture. So local superstition, that kind of thing. Sort of blending Catholicism with local traditions and superstitions.
Putting the cult in local culture.
Oh, yeah. There was also the time that Chile almost was invaded by Argentina. That was exciting. As you recall, the Argentine government was very unpopular on account of the economic downturn. Also because of all the violence, all the murder and torture and whatnot wasn't doing them any favors. And so one of the things that they were looking at was invading Chile, because Chile and Argentina are kind of long-running rivals. They've had border disputes, especially in Tierra del Fuego down in the south. And for a while, generals in Argentina were actually considering a border war, basically to boost popularity. And ultimately, they backed off of that, partly because of the Pope. The Pope kind of interceded there. And also, I think one of the generals had some kind of divine revelation that he shouldn't do that, that it would be wrong somehow. So I think they did draw up the plans, but eventually backed off. Didn't stop them from invading the Falklands, though. I think that wasn't long after. Yeah, the Falklands War definitely didn't do their image in the United States any favors either. I'm not sure. I don't think Brazil had as many problems in that regard. Although Brazil didn't really care much what America thought. Certainly the military junta that governed Brazil from, what was it, like 1965 to the late 80s, they didn't have any love for leftists. They were just as violent in many ways. But the difference is that, unlike the other military juntas, Brazil's junta didn't have great relations with the United States. One of the reasons the previous liberal government had been overthrown is because they were perceived to have failed to extract sufficient concessions from the United States as far as aid and industrialization and other economic issues. In general, the right wing in Brazil was more nationalist and more protectionist, and they wanted to kind of move away from liberalism. And the United States didn't particularly like that, but so long as they weren't communist, they were generally willing to let it slide. So relations between Brazil and the United States kind of trowed a little bit. Well, not trowed, peaked a little bit, you could say, in the early 1960s, and then declined a bit in the late 60s and through the 70s. So they definitely cooperated in Operation Condor, but relations were never as tight as, say, U.S. cooperation relations with Argentina and Chile during that period. Yeah, the CIA was pretty active in Peru and Bolivia because I remember that Che Guevara was killed while he was active in Bolivia. After the revolution in Cuba, there was some question about what to do, and Castro kind of decided that it would be better to get rid of his big rival and have him go off to go and fight somewhere else outside Cuba. So Che Guevara ended up fighting, I think, in Africa, in Angola specifically. It was weirdly enough, there was a large contingent of Cuban troops that fought in the Angolan Civil War on the side of the socialist faction. And Che Guevara was a part of that expedition for a while. And I think later on, he redeployed to Bolivia to try to inculcate revolution there. Bolivia was a pretty good choice. There's a pretty large number of disenfranchised, poor people there, especially the native population that would have been pretty receptive to the message. But alas, at the time, well, maybe not alas, he's pretty violent in his own right. But in the course of his operations in Bolivia, the CIA supported the government, and government security forces were able to track down his contingent and kill all of them, basically. There's, I think, a famous picture of the Bolivian special forces that caught him kind of posing next to his body. So the CIA was definitely active there, but that would have happened in the 60s, not the 70s. So I'm not sure what was going on in Bolivia during Operation Condor, or whether or not they would have even wanted to participate. I think Venezuela was pretty quiet during that period. I think they did have an authoritarian government, but I don't think it was as violent as the other ones. In general, they had enough oil money coming in that they were pretty much able to buy off dissidents. Oh, I don't even know what Ecuador was doing. Yeah, Ecuador and Paraguay are frequently my blind spots. Yeah, Panama had some protests, but I don't know if they would have been involved in CIA shenanigans per se. They had nationalist protests. They wanted to nationalize the Panama Canal, which at that time was still American territory, technically. The Panama Canal Zone was kind of a separate territory from the rest of Panama, and the United States had basically leased it. The United States did not formally hand the canal over until like the 1997, something like that. So some nationalists in Panama were pretty upset about that for a long time. Yeah, I think the others were pretty quiet. Costa Rica was pretty quiet. I think Haiti and the Dominican Republic were pretty quiet. They had more drama in the 60s. I think by the 70s, Papa Doc Duvalier and Haiti, and then the military junta that ran the Dominican Republic were pretty well ensconced in power. Yeah, I remember the U.S. had to help murder Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. He was dictator for like 30 years or something like that. And he was just super erratic to the point where he was more liability than asset. And so the CIA actually ended up funneling weapons and money to dissident groups in the Dominican Republic so that they could assassinate him. Yeah, Guatemala, there had to have been CIA involvement in Guatemala, but the Civil War lasted like 50 years. It started in the early 50s and then ran into the early 90s. So the CIA was definitely involved in the start of that conflict. That had to do with the coup back in the early 50s. I don't remember what the operation was, but that's like a well-known CIA operation. That was one of the first times that they helped overthrow a government. But after that, I'm not sure what they did. I imagine they would have helped the government fight the rebellion, but I don't know how involved they would have been. And then Nicaragua, that's another example of a bad leader. The Somoza family rather ran Nicaragua basically as their personal fiefdom from the 40s? 19th, actually, it probably would have been 30s, so roughly from the 1930s into the 70s. And they were a little too authoritarian for their own good and ended up fighting a rebellion. So the Nicaraguan Civil War started in the 70s, I think. And that would have been when the Somozas were fighting off the rebels. So I imagine there would have been significant CIA activity there helping them out. And then, of course, famously, there would have been CIA activity after the Somoza family was overthrown. That was when the Sandinistas were able to take power. And then, of course, the United States didn't like the Sandinistas because they were perceived as being too left-wing and too close to the Soviets. So there was what was called the Contras, which were basically counter-revolutionary guerrilla forces, were funded by the United States, no doubt via the CIA. And they tried to overthrow the government pretty unsuccessfully, but they always had lots of money and guns. So the war did kind of dragged out for like 10 years until a peace agreement could be reached in the, I want to say, early 90s again. And then, of course, El Salvador had a long-ass civil war in the 1980s. But I don't think they had as much violence in the 70s. I know they had a military government, but I don't think they were as bad at the time, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know how interested the CIA would have been with them in the 70s. I think most everybody else was still a colony at that time. A bunch of the countries in the Caribbean and the Lesser Antilles were still colonies, or at least nominally anyway. Kind of moving towards independence, but the process was still pretty incomplete. So I don't think the US messed with them too much. I think we kind of left that to the British. Yeah, a lot of those were former British colonies. And then I think Guyana and Suriname were still European territories as well up until like 1975. Early mid 70s, I think, is when Guyana and Suriname became independent. And I don't know how interested the United States was in them because they were super poor. I think those are all that I can remember. Well, I guess there's Mexico, but Mexico had a kind of awkward position in the Cold War because in the 19 teens, so to speak, from 1910 to 1920, the Mexican Revolution happened, and in that revolution, uh, left-wing Republicans were able to overthrow the government and seize power. And that was, of course, the beginning of what was called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which created an authoritarian one-party state in Mexico afterwards. And so, being a left-wing party, they were kind of nominally, ideologically, more aligned with the Soviets. But they also had on its northern border the United States. So in the Cold War, there was kind of this awkward relationship between the US and Mexico. Like, obviously, Mexico was not like the super pro-capitalist, pro-Western. In general, they preferred neutrality more than anything. Neutrality and non-interventionism have been cornerstones of Mexico's foreign policy since the Mexican Revolution. But just having the United States on the northern border definitely would have weighed on their calculations. So basically, what happened is that the United States and Mexico built a relatively healthy relationship over the course of World War II. Especially in the lead up to World War II, the Roosevelt administration reached out to them and tried to improve relations by giving this, that, and the other concession. Generally, things like allowing the Mexican government to nationalize oil assets without complaining. Pretty much all those oil assets have been owned by Standard Oil Corporation, a U.S. company. So normally the U.S. government would raise a big stink about it and would demand compensation, but it was more useful to allow them to do that without too much comment in order to build relations. And so over the course of the World War II, institutions were built. I think the Pan American Union, I think it was called at the time. Relations were improved by way of foreign aid and other cooperative efforts. So by the end of World War II, relations were pretty decent, even though they were kind of on different ends of the ideological spectrum to a degree. Although to be fair, Mexico's Institutional Revolutionary Party kind of moved towards the right with time. They were not like a Marxist socialist organization by any means. So especially in the 1940s, the pro-business wing of the party tended to be more in charge. But even so, the United States obviously did not want Mexico to move towards the Soviet Union or to have a lot of like radical extremists coming to power. So basically, there was just kind of an understanding that the relationship as defined by the World War II experience, the Pan American Union and what later became the OAS, the Organization of American States. Basically, those institutions were the ones through which they operated. So Mexico was non-interventionist, it was neutral, didn't really pick a side in the Cold War, and in general, it supported efforts to kind of manage diplomatic differences between Western hemispheric states through hemispheric institutions. Mexico didn't much like the United States trying to use the OAS to suppress communism. That was a little too interventionist for them. So they were pretty skeptical of that. But other than that, they never really saw cause to uh, really go after the United States in terms of like hosting Soviet bases or anything like that. They were never so socialist as to be involved in the Cold War in that vein. So very much a neutral power in that sense. I think in the 1960s, they also ended up, there was some unrest in the 1960s against the authoritarian government, and that resulted in a massacre, I think just before the Mexico City Olympics. There was a bunch of people, mostly students, protesting in the Mexico City, but I'm trying to remember the square. It was like Tenochtitlan Square or something like that. Basically, the main square in Mexico City, and armed forces were called out and ended up opening fire on them, killed a whole bunch of people. I think it was several dozen.
Tenochtitlan.
There you go.
It's, I think, one of those like Aztec words is how it's spelled and pronounced, so kind of tricky.
Yeah, that was the name of Mexico City before it was colonized.
Yeah.
That was the capital of the Aztec Empire. Yeah, the Spaniards drained the lake that it was located in and rechristened it Mexico City to be the capital of their new empire in the Americas, New Spain.
They drained the lake?
Yeah, Tenochtitlan was originally a city located on a series of islands in the middle of a very large lake. And if you Google pictures of Tenochtitlan, you'll actually see the lake. You'll actually see like it was connected to the mainland by way of these giant bridges, causeways, basically. And even the city itself was connected together with bridges and stuff between the different islands. It was actually really cool. They were very innovative, very advanced for the time. What they would do is that they would actually grow crops in soil that was located in boats. And they would have these boats just kind of floating around in different parts of the city. That would be part of where they would get there. They would also grow crops on the land like normal, but they also had this neat system of growing crops like in the water. It was pretty cool. They also had a system for ensuring that part of the lake was potable. Basically, because there was so much salt in the surrounding mountains, the lake was originally a saltwater lake, which meant that they couldn't really drink out of it and that fish couldn't really live in it, and it was just kind of a problem. So, in order to deal with that, the Aztecs actually had the engineering acumen to create a series of dams and basically separators, that blocked the flow of salt water into part of the lake. And they also built like a huge separating wall that kind of blocked off a chunk of the lake. And so one chunk of the lake was fresh water, and then the other chunk was salt water. And I think largely the city was in the freshwater chunk. Yeah, they were very good at engineering. They were very advanced. Probably more advanced in some ways than the Spaniards that were coming to colonize them. But yeah, it was a very cool city in terms of its layout. It was in the middle of a giant lake. And after the Spaniards were successful in conquering it, they just drained all of that. They implemented their own series of dams and whatnot and waterworks, such that all that lake just disappeared. And Mexico City is actually built on that lake bed to the point where there is some concern that if there were seismic activity, a volcano going off or an earthquake, that the city might suffer grievously because the lake bed, the soil that comprised the lake bed is very loose. It's not the same as like the rock you might find here in Texas. Texas is basically built on a giant limestone rock, and so it's relatively stable. But the soil under Mexico City is not, so it would vibrate a lot more in the event of an earthquake.
Hmm.
But yeah, they drained that lake, and the city expanded out onto it.
Did not know that. One thing that is interesting about Mexico too is that it's not just Aztec. There were other peoples who reached a high level of civilization. I think it's the Inca people, or Mayan.
Oh yeah. Well, they all did.
Mayans and Incas. I'm trying to think about where it was.
Well, the Mayans were Mesoamerica. That was like Chiapas Peninsula. That's basically like Guatemala and then the very southern part of Mexico. That's more where they were.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Aztecs were more like in the middle of Mexico. Basically, like that big plateau that Mexico City is on. That was more like the core of Aztec territory.
Inca was Peru. Thank you.
Yeah. Incan Empire was down there in Peru. There was also a smaller kingdom in Colombia that was relatively advanced. I forget their name, but they were also active at that time. Also conquered about the same time. Yeah, there was also a big civilization for a while in the Mississippi Basin up here in North America. Most of their architecture was mound stuff, mound buildings of one kind or another. And I think their heyday was more like in the 1200s and 1300s. I think I read that after that they disappeared pretty quickly for the most part. I think there was still some in the 1500s because I know the conquistadors encountered them. Actually, they burned one of the cities pretty much. Yeah, there was an expedition to try to find gold or some shit, and I think they started out somewhere east of the Mississippi and then traveled on foot northwest. And they started encountering some of these big mound cities. And the natives didn't really get along with them, especially after they started attacking the city. And after that, they were basically harassed continually by the native population until they were basically driven out. It could also be that the Spaniards introduced some diseases like smallpox and whatnot, and maybe that cascaded through the Mississippi civilization's networks of trade, and that may have also just wiped them out, whatever was left of them. Yeah, basically for a long time there were mounds that people couldn't explain here in North America. We just kind of find them like around, and for a long time people just thought they were hills. But eventually it came out that they were actually originally structures. They were originally, what they would do is they would build these big mounds and then build houses on top of them. And the idea was that that would defeat any kind of flooding. Because back before, the Army Corps of Engineers basically created all of the levees along the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River used to flood pretty frequently. So if you're going to build a city next to the river, it really behooved you to build it relatively high. So that your house and belongings and whatnot didn't just get flooded away, depending on what time of year it was. But all of that is relatively recent stuff. That's more like early mid-20th century archaeology that figured that out. But yeah, the Spaniards mostly focused on Mesoamerica and South America, so Aztecs and Incans definitely more the focus. Some trivia for you, Neuro. Did you know that the original Aztec language, Nahuatl, is actually still spoken? Yeah. There's not a lot of native speakers left, but they are still out there. There's also still speakers of the original Mayan language, or at least one of them.
It's pretty sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, people survived.
Linguistics is kind of like genealogy in that you can trace a lot of things back. So their language as well would have some lineage. Going over the Bering Strait way back, if you go back far enough, you have overlapping kind of structure within certain languages, so you can more or less see what common ancestors they share.
Yeah, you can trace them genetically, and just looking at a map, you can kind of see how they've displaced each other. So it's it's definitely fun to kind of trace how they've changed with time. The Native Americans are particularly hard because we don't have great records, and there's not as much. Well, I guess we still have some genetic evidence, There's a lot of debate about like where Native Americans originated from. Obviously, the land bridge over Alaska is like the main theory, but there's also some people who say that there may have been Polynesian colonization in like South America. Yeah, that's never been proven, but there's some genetic evidence, I think. And there was one guy, one researcher who wanted to prove it, and so he actually got onto a traditional Polynesian ship of the kind that would have been common like around the Middle Ages. And pretty much by himself, or maybe with a team, I don't quite remember, he wanted to sail from a Polynesian island to South America just to show that it was feasible. And I think he did so. I think he succeeded.
Hmm.
So hypothetically, it could have been done. Let's see. I think we had a couple more questions. Any comments on economic hitmen? I know exactly who this questioner is thinking of.
I don't. Who is it?
There was a book written called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and it was written by, I don't remember his name. I'm going to look it up. John Perkins, that's who he was. So John Perkins was active in Latin America during the Cold War, specifically during like the 60s and 70s. And during his time there, he says that he was a CIA agent responsible for manipulating and sabotaging Latin American economies for the benefit of US interests of one sort or another, presumably to try to make left-wing governments look bad and to make right-wing governments look good, and to otherwise maintain Latin America's dependency on the US economically. And I don't dispute that he was there at the time. It seems that there's substantive evidence that he was involved in something down there. Like, I don't remember what it was exactly, but whether or not he was involved with the CIA is a little more debatable. And I question his credibility just because I actually saw him speak in college. He came to my university, and at the time I'd heard him promoting his book on the radio, and it sounded really interesting. I was kind of curious about, the CIA and careers in national security, and I was like, okay, well, let's listen to him talk and see what he has to say. It'll be interesting, professionally and historically. And I go there, and it was just such a horse and pony show. Like there was so much theater that I had a really hard time taking him seriously. Like he had the Native American cleansing dance at the beginning, and he had these long rants, and at the end there was the guy standing up and yelling about American aggression against Cuba. Like the whole thing just kind of felt a little bit surreal. So beyond that, I mean, his claims are not completely unreasonable. I mean, I don't doubt that the US was involved in manipulating economies to some degree. Like the US has basically admitted that it was involved in trying to, specifically during the Nixon administration, trying to sabotage the Allende administration in Chile, which was a left-wing socialist administration that was a little more radical than the US government was comfortable with, specifically the Nixon administration. And so they applied certain sanctions, and they talked to US companies and asked them to, restrict the flow of goods to this, that, or the other company, just to kind of make economic conditions a little worse than they would have been. They were already kind of bad anyway. Allende's policies were not particularly great. They were invariably going to cause economic disruption regardless, but the US made it worse, basically. Went out of its way to make it worse in order to try to exacerbate polarization within Chilean politics. And that, of course, paved the way for the coup that saw Pinochet come to power. So, yeah, the US was definitely involved in economic manipulations to varying degrees. But I just don't know if John Perkins is one of those guys. And I don't think he ever really elaborated much, at least when I listened to him talk, on what exactly he was doing to actually sabotage economies. He was always a little bit cagey on the details. So I guess those would be my comments on economic hitmen. And I don't want to cast too many aspersions on the guy. I haven't like investigated him thoroughly per se. I was just kind of turned off by his little talk that I went to. But I will say that after the talk, there was a table set up outside the amphitheater, and that on that table there were people giving away free DVDs.
Oh,
So what was on those DVDs, Neuro?
I don't know.
I'll tell you. The title printed on each of them was The Truth About 9/11.
Oh,
So, if I was skeptical coming out of the amphitheater, I was even more skeptical after seeing that. That definitely was something of a red flag for me.
skepticism levels rising.
Yeah. So to be fair, he may not have had anything to do with those guys. Those guys may have just set up of their own accord. So, I would not necessarily put that against him, but it didn't really jibe well with the rest of the presentation.
Hmm. Yep, chat's just piling on. 7-Eleven is a part-time job. That's pretty cool, though. You don't often get like a first-hand account of someone asks you about a person, and you're like, I actually saw them give a talk. Oh,
Yeah, that would have been way back when. It would have been like 2006, 2007, something like that. It's been a while. But yeah, I never quite looked at that guy the same way after that. Before that, I kind of thought, oh, that's really interesting. I bet he knows like some interesting inside stuff about Latin America. And then after that, I was like, oh, this guy's probably just an opportunist. I did note later on that he actually wrote a bunch of books about getting high in Latin America. Something about like acid trips or something, personal journeys, that kind of thing.
hmm.
So it's not like he's written a whole lot of books about being a CIA agent and whatnot. He's definitely gets paid to be a speaker on that. He kind of makes the rounds in certain quarters of the internet and whatnot. But beyond that, I think his bigger bag is that he's kind of a hippie more than anything.
I'm thinking about a general concept, or I guess a trend that can happen as you discover a person who says words. Oftentimes, the person has a really good opener in the sense of the words that they start out with are in a combination that excites you. You're like, wow, CIA agent behind enemy lines, helping topple governments to shift the global perception of this and that. Like, that's bold and that's crazy. So people immediately think, wow, like there must be something to this. But sometimes, not to pick on this guy as a particular person, but the more that they talk, the more that you realize you actually don't really know too much about this at all. And then they'll continue to back it up with more and more shaky claims where if you don't ever have that little light bulb moment of, I'm kind of skeptical of that point, and you just let them run with it and assume everything they're saying is true, they can get away with a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
Some people
yeah,
appear smart the further away you are from them.
unfortunately so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to control that here by being open.
Yeah, Agent Smith just opens with telling people that he's ignorant and then he continues with the conversation. It's a good strat because everyone is ignorant of most things, but some people will try to avoid admitting that wherever they can.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of my impression of this guy in general. But let's see. So there was that question, and then the last one here was, can you elaborate about the genocide in Chile? I don't think there was a genocide in Chile, was there? I mean, other than like the Latin American genocide, anyway. I did mention politicide earlier, but that's not the same thing as genocide. Politicide is kind of like an abstract academic idea, the idea that governments are going out of their way to kill political opponents of a particular ideology.
Hmm.
But that's not really something that's ever been proven. And there's kind of a lot of overlap with just general authoritarian violence. So it's kind of a charged term to a degree. But yeah, there was a lot of violence against, left-wingers, ideologically speaking, over the course of the Cold War, in the 60s and 70s in particular. Now, if you're just asking about like genocide in Chile in general, then yeah, there was I think the Mapuche, the Native Americans in southern Chile, have kind of borne the brunt of that. They're actually still around, and I think they're still, pretty decent sized chunk of the population in southern Chile. I think the new constitution is supposed to reserve some seats for them in the new legislature. I think that's an idea that's been bandied around, though. I'm not sure if that's going to end up in the final constitution. Yeah, the Mapuche are pretty tough. They're kind of known for being fighters. They were able to kind of hold off the Spanish for a pretty decent amount of time after they first colonized the area. Oh, we did get another question here. What has happened to the January 6th protesters? Have they been charged yet? A lot of them have. Yeah, a lot of them have either been charged or have already gone to jail. There's been some consternation with some people getting off with relatively light sentences, but technically those people were punished. There's been some conspiracy theories too, because there was a couple of people involved with the protests, slash riot, slash whatever you want to call it. Uh, there were some people involved who were basically let off. And so there's some suspicion that maybe some of those people were actually FBI informants or FBI agents who were acting to agitate the crowd and try to incite them to assail. It's the word I keep using. Assail the Capitol building. So in that sense, the conspiracy theory is that it was an inside job, that the FBI was just trying to frame these people and incite them to doing something it could punish them for.
That seems very elaborate and like a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Incite
think.
people to take on a capital so that you can do what later? Throw them in jail? You can throw people in jail for a lot less than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of the claims. There is some evidence that there were FBI informers present at the protest slash riot. So it's not as though they're completely making it up, but the idea that the FBI had it in mind to use those people to incite the events that transpired, that's pretty big stretch for me. I don't really buy that. But yeah, in general, the vast majority of the people involved have been, well, the vast majority of people who were involved and were identified have been punished to some degree or in the process of being punished.
People were involved to many varying different degrees, from like actively breaking windows and climbing inside and then messing up people's offices to people who are kind of yelling in the back but didn't actually break in. That's kind of the job of the legal system, to be able to describe like what are the laws, what's been infringed upon, and what is the respective punishment range for such a thing. I think the punishments are going to be, they've been lighter than we would expect because it was kind of a disorganized impromptu. You had a bunch of suburban moms and dads who were just there, and they kind of got caught up in the frenzy and ended up perpetrating crimes that I don't think they understood the gravity of. There were certainly some groups there who were like, yeah, we have objectives, we want to go to this place, we want to do these things, and they were more focused about it. But some people were just kind of listening to the voices behind them of saying like, push forward, keep doing stuff, and that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Still means that you broke the law, but whenever they're deciding the punishments, it would probably be less severe if someone was, through their ignorance, bumbling forward rather than someone who maliciously was working with motives and so on.
Yeah, I kind of think that's the thought process there. Let's see. Did you see the big tornado in Kentucky?
People were just asking about that in chat, actually.
Yeah, there was a big F5 that blew through. I think it lasted something like 80 miles. Is that what it was? That's very unusual. For those of you from outside the United States, or maybe people from inside the United States, who are not familiar with tornadoes, generally they don't last all that long. Maybe it's just a couple minutes. And generally they're like F1s, F2s, and whatnot. So this one was a big-ass F5, the most powerful category of tornado. And it lasted like 80 miles, and it cut through a whole bunch of towns and, kind of some built-up areas, and just a whole bunch of people got killed. I think it was, what was it, like 80? I don't even remember what the death toll was.
Damn.
Let's see. Yeah, at least 80. That's what Google is saying. It was quite destructive. Let's see. That happened. Oh, have you been following this tennis player thing in China?
No.
Okay. We can do that real quick here. I don't remember her name, so I have to look it up. Peng Shuai?
And she was playing tennis and doing what else?
She's a professional tennis player, and she's. I guess that's kind of the gist of her background. I don't know enough about her background to know more than that. But she got into the international news because she came out and accused a high-ranking Communist Party official of having sexually assaulted her over a period of time. Basically, he coerced her into a illicit relationship that she did not want. And she put out a pretty interesting statement. Let me see if I can find that. I don't think I'm going to be able to find it quickly here, but yeah, she issued a statement. She came out and accused the guy, and that's a pretty ballsy thing to do in China, because, whenever you're throwing accusations around to me about leading officials like that, you can bet you're going to get the hammer. And that's what happened. She basically disappeared not long after that. And so there was a big upcry in the, uproar rather, in the tennis world. In the tennis world, a lot of people were asking, what happened to her, what's going on. And the tennis association, there's like a leading association that organizes tennis tournaments, and they were demanding basically that they provide some proof of life. Although I also think they were criticized for not doing more, so maybe I'm thinking of a different group. But anyway, she was produced. There was like an email produced in which she was saying that she's fine. The accusations were exaggerated, etc. All this kind of walking back type of thing. And eventually the pressure piled up enough that the government made a video of her in which she was all smiles and said, "I'm fine," yada, yada, etc. Proof of life video, if you like.
I'm fine, by the way, and the government is the best.
Yeah. So people are pretty skeptical about all that, and so there's been talk about blocking China. Well, not necessarily block it, but not holding further tennis tournaments in China, basically until her safety is verified, in some capacity. So there's been drama over that that's kind of superseded with the Olympics drama. Have you heard anything about that?
Yes, well, some of it has to do with COVID. And then, where were they going to host it this next time?
Beijing.
Oh, yeah.
Beijing Winter Olympics. So there's a lot of criticism of China owing to human rights abuses vis-a-vis Xinjiang and the Uyghur ethnic group. And the Peng Shuai thing isn't really doing them any favors either. So there's been more and more of a push to declare a boycott of the upcoming Olympics. So the thing about a boycott is that hurts the athletes pretty significantly. And a lot of people don't want to do that, but they still want to send a message. And so what they've decided to do is hold what's called a diplomatic boycott. So you're not required to send public officials to observe the Olympics. That's totally just voluntary. So what's going to happen is that the United States and a bunch of other like-minded countries are just going to not send diplomats or other representatives to participate in the Olympics in any way. And that's basically, again, done as a protest over human rights abuses in China. So that's definitely going to happen. The Chinese government was upset about it and issued some sternly worded Twitter tweets of one sort or another in response, but beyond that, it's mostly been for show. But technically, that has been a source of some drama in the news recently. Let's see. I just got some random items I'm getting through here. Did you hear about the smoking ban in New Zealand?
Yes.
Oh, you did hear that. What did you
Yes.
think of that?
They're banning it for like future generations, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
basically what they're doing is banning it for everybody, but grandfathering older folks in.
Ah. If you're over a certain age, you may continue smoking. Everybody else, you better stop smoking.
Exactly.
It's interesting because it's kind of balancing personal freedom with what if people with their freedom would choose something that would kill themselves over time slowly. Smoking cigarettes, science has more or less shown that it's very unhealthy and there isn't a debate about it at all. So I can see why they would do that. I can also say that if that were attempted to pass in the US, I bet a lot of people would be super mad. They would say it's a slippery slope toward other kinds of bans of things. So it's something that I cannot really see happening here, but I can see why they might push for it there.
Yeah, I don't think New Zealand has the kind of anti-statist politics that we do here in the US.
Mm.
So I don't think it's been as much of a problem. I'm sure it's controversial to a degree, but the government seems to have enough support to be confident in moving forward with it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Stable coins. Have you heard of stable coins, Neuro?
Stable coins?
Yeah.
No.
Oh man. There's probably a whole bunch of people in chat that are super excited at that and will be happy to explain
Is
it
it
to you.
something regarding crypto?
It is.
Ooh, people
It is
love
indeed.
asking about crypto.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure your followers will know more about it than I do, but basically, stable coins are a type of cryptocurrency that differs from regular cryptocurrency in that the coins are backed by actual hard currency. So whereas cryptocurrencies are worth what people are willing to pay them, stable coins are worth whatever they're backed with. So, a coin might be backed with US dollars or, Japanese yen, euros, whatever. So which means that you can always basically are guaranteed to be able to exchange your coin for that money by the issuer.
Mm-hmm.
So stable coins are supposed to be more stable, therefore the name, than cryptocurrencies because they're actually backed by something instead of just being market-based. That's my rough understanding. I invite correction on that from the various crypto mavens that are no doubt listening. But I bring it up because it's become something of an object of interest on the part of regulators. Cryptocurrency hasn't received quite as much attention, but stablecoins have, because there's more, relatively speaking, similarities between stablecoins and traditional banks. With a bank, you can deposit your money and then you get fiat. Well, historically, you've been able to deposit something like gold and then you get money out. So now there's something similar happening with these stable coin outfits, wherein you can deposit actual currency and then you get a coin in return. And then hypothetically, you can redeem it later if you want to. So the similarity there kind of brings into question whether or not this could impact monetary supply, because these institutions could act as de facto banks and increase money supply or decrease it depending on how much they loan out, using their currency reserves as a base. So therein lies some concern on the part of central banks, and some of them have started regulating stable coins in order to kind of restrict their operations. And central banks have also started issuing their own digital coins in order to kind of get around this, because they think that if they have their own digital currency, then that'll sort of deflate interest in stable coins, sufficient that they won't have to worry so much about regulating them. And I would just point out here that digital coins sound fancy, but basically it's just an e-wallet. That's sort of the key technology there. The digital coins, the digital currencies, I should say, they're creating are all generally cryptocurrencies, uh, to one degree or another. But the technology that they're innovating here, the new thing that they're innovating here is the e-wallets. Because what a central bank can do is just create an e-wallet for everybody. They can create an e-wallet that is linked somehow to your, I don't know, your social security number, for example, in the United States or something. And that's money that you have direct access to and can spend however you want. So that makes it a lot easier then for a central bank to engage in some kind of economic stimulus in response to, say, an economic downturn. So instead of giving money to, say, banks that have deposits with the central bank and then hoping that they engage in economic activity that boosts growth in response to an economic downturn, instead, a central bank could hypothetically just basically print money, or more accurately, credit money to the e-wallets of regular people at the central bank. And in that way, they could directly increase consumption in response to a downturn. So that would be a pretty interesting monetary experiment. And it's that kind of policy that central banks are looking at implementing in the future. They're kind of setting up the groundwork and the foundation for it by creating these digital currencies and e-wallets and whatnot. But that's also a way to try to mitigate the potential damaging impact of out of control cryptocurrency institutions that could compete with the central bank as a kind of financial institution.
China has shadow banks. The United States has stablecoin banks. Will the banks go under when everyone has turned away from them?
Possibly, that's also a concern. If these outfits collapse, that could also have potential ramifications. Probably relatively limited. I don't think they're big enough to be all that threatening now, but they could hypothetically be in the future. Let's see. A couple other items here I wanted to get to. So we talked a bit about inflation before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Actually, let me ask you, have you noticed inflation at all?
Gas prices have been going up quite a bit over the past few years, it seemed like. On a personal level, not a ton, but some. Kind of thinking about the relative purchases that your standard person makes. What does a meal cost? What does rent cost? What are your bills normally? And all that stuff has been ballpark the same.
Mhm. Gotcha. I guess I would extend that question to Chad, well, specifically to Americans listening, but I guess also from other people from other countries as well. To what degree have you noticed inflation in your economy over the past year?
Someone saying their
Feedback.
groceries are $15 to $20 more per week. Gas, food, and utilities are all up.
Yeah,
Because
that's all.
we should
Go ahead.
expect them to normally go up, right?
Yeah, some, but for the past couple decades, it's been increasing at a very low rate.
Mm-hmm.
And over the past year, it's been accelerated considerably. Inflation now is actually at its highest in the United States in like 30, 40 years, something like that. It's a considerable jump. And, we've talked about it before on here, and I've generally been of the mind that it's probably temporary. Kind of like what the Fed says, it's transient inflation. Basically, it has to do with supply bottlenecks caused by COVID lockdowns and other such things. And also just the giant surge in demand that happened at the same time, late 2020 after the announcement of the vaccines. From that point on, there's been a pretty considerable increase in economic demand. So you're just trying to shove more stuff into a narrower space, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Supply is narrowing at the same time demand is increasing. So that's generally been the explanation for inflation. Uh, the problem, though, is that if inflation is not supply driven but is demand driven, then the Fed is invariably going to have to increase interest rates at some point, and that's going to create problems for a whole bunch of industries that have become a little too dependent on low interest rates and easy money. So there's some question as to the credibility of the Fed's commitment to fighting inflation in that regard. So as a result of that debate, people are watching inflation very closely to figure out, to kind of tease out how much of inflation is due to supply restrictions and how much is due to demand, economic demand. Basically supply pull inflation as opposed to demand push inflation. Actually, supply push as opposed to demand pull inflation.
Hmm.
And up till now, I've generally been more of the mind that it's mostly been supply push. But there is some survey data now that suggests that there's more demand pull inflation happening. There was a survey asking about expectations about prices in the future, and it seems more and more people are starting to expect inflation in the future. And that's a big problem because that, well, for one, it impacts buying behavior. People are more inclined to buy now than in the future if they think prices are increasing. That
Hmm.
makes sense because you want to buy stuff when it's cheaper. And so that kind of creates a chain reaction because if more people are buying sooner rather than later, that creates more inflation because
Hmm.
more people are buying. But then that creates even more inflation and even more of an incentive to buy now. So that's a possibility there. And also, if people expect inflation to happen, they'll start pricing that into their wages and into their prices if they're a producer. And once people start increasing those, there's the potential for a reciprocating cycle of price increases and wage increases that basically just pushes inflation by itself without regard to actual economic production and demand factors. So that's what you would call runaway inflation. So that's kind of the concern right now. Are we on a path to runaway inflation, or is this still mostly supply driven? In which case, presumably at some point, the supply bottlenecks will ease out and there will be deflationary pressure that kind of balances out the inflationary demand pull pressure. That's what we're watching. So the fact that there's survey data now suggesting that demand is playing a bigger role is of concern. And that could lead to greater concern later if that data continues to suggest that demand is becoming more and more of a factor to the point where the Fed will have to start taking action to compensate it at some point. They've already said that they kind of want to, even if there is inflationary pressure like that, they've said that they kind of want to let it run for a little bit in order to kind of offset some of the past 10 years of economic malaise and in order to allow wages to rise a little bit. So, even if this is going to happen, even if runaway inflation is a risk, they'll probably not deal with it right away. But when they do, regardless if that's sooner or later, it's definitely going to have an impact that has broader economic ramifications, especially in sectors like technology or housing, where lending is, where interest rates are an important factor.
Chad's pointing out a good point of how if you have inflation happening, a lot of different categories, they list groceries, rent, various different expenses, all of those are a little bit more as a total, but your wages don't also go up at the same time, then that puts pressure on just the individual where you suddenly can't afford stuff that you could before, so you have to cut some of what you were getting yourself. Maybe you treat yourself less for a vacation, maybe you have some fun spending that you just have to cut. So that's something that's going to make certain people feel pressured. And then you could obviously draw the line of where people wouldn't earn enough to make a living if these prices keep going up. They've compared just what you would make from a minimum wage job back in the 60s and 70s and 80s compared to rent costs. And it seems like the wages have not been going up to match what inflation has been over the past several decades.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Wages have stagnated for lower income earners in the United States for several decades now.
How do you fix that?
How do you fix that? Man, that's a that's a tough question.
Did I ask you a bajillion dollar question?
Yeah, that's a bajillion dollar question. The factors that go into that are, there are multiple factors that determine that. I just want to say real quick before I forget that the commenter in question is absolutely right that real wages, that is to say, wages adjusted for inflation, are actually declining right now. So even if wages are going up, people are losing ground, so to speak, because of inflation. And I would also point out that it's not just energy and food prices that are going up. Inflation is frequently driven by food and energy because those are more volatile. But what you can do is cut those out and look at what's called core inflation, which cuts out the volatile stuff and just looks at core stuff that people consume from month to month.
Hmm.
And even that is actually going up in price right now. The core inflation, I think, is at something like 6%. Uh, and inflation as a whole is like 8%, which is pretty high, especially the longer it goes on. So we'll see. Some of that is base effect, to agree. Prices fell during the 2020 COVID recession cluster fudge. So having gone down, it was inevitable that when they went back up, it would look like there was price increases. But I think we're kind of pretty well past that effect at this point. So I just wanted to point out those factors real quick. But yes, how do you deal with stagnant wages, specifically stagnant wages for lower income earners? So part of the reason for that is partly because of immigration. There was a big flood of workers into the United States, mostly from Mexico, starting in the 1970s and through the 80s, and I guess also through the 90s and a chunk of the aughts. But then around 2008, that slowed down, and since then, it's been more Central American and Caribbean. There's also a lot of people that come in from Asia, rather, and overstay their visas. That's also a significant source. But in general, I think those tend to be more middle income to higher income earners. Generally, the lower income scale, so to speak, the lower income part of the income distribution is more impacted by undocumented immigration into the United States. So that's had a downward effect on wages. There's also the deregulation in the 1970s and 80s. That's resulted in more, relatively speaking, gains from technology and other factors going more towards capital and ownership rather than workers. Women entering the workforce in greater numbers starting in the 70s and then especially in the 80s also significantly, well, created more competition, and that was a downward effect on wages, although it actually increased the overall aggregate income in the United States. I've heard that a lot of the economic gains in the United States can be attributed in the 1980s anyway to the tech sector, basically, kind of blowing up, and then also to women entering the workforce because that created a whole lot of new demand. But because they're competing for, relatively speaking, the same jobs, that also created downward pressure on wages. So those are three factors right there. International competition is an obvious one, especially after China entered the WTO. That created a lot of leverage for capital that they used against workers in order to either well, they could move the factory completely, obviously, but they could also threaten to move the factory. And in that way, they were able to get concessions from workers and unions in the form of lower benefits, lower wages, etc. So that's a fourth factor. Technological change is also a factor. Just in general, manufacturing processes are more sophisticated now and require more, again, relatively speaking, more skilled workers. And so that means that there are fewer jobs, but better paying jobs in a lot of manufacturing sector firms. But that, of course, disproportionately disadvantages the previous workforce, which had been relatively unskilled, but also more numerous. There used to be a lot of jobs that were relatively low paying, but still living wage, in factories. Now, generally, the structure of factories is such that they employ relatively fewer people at better wages. So that's left that cohort of blue collar workers kind of out in the cold. So that's also a factor.
Mm.
I'm sure there's other more nuanced stuff like tax policy and redistribution and the Reagan Revolution and the Contract for America and other political type stuff. But in general, these are kind of the factors that are coming to mind here. So how do you deal with that? I mean, the political answer is just redistribute more. I mean, you can have redistributive policies that help people retrain so that they can, get another job. We kind of already do that, and it's not particularly effective, but we could try to improve it. We could try to do more protectionism, such that relatively more jobs are in the United States, and such that labor has relatively more leverage vis-a-vis capital and management. We could shore up labor laws such that it's easier to start a union and that people are entitled to more concessions, in the form of things like benefits and whatnot. We could clamp down on immigration so that there's fewer workers competing for blue collar work. I mean, these are basically just things off the top. These are like textbook economics type stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, things that are meant to alleviate inflation. I think the notion of redistribution, you're talking about, you're taxing more because money has to come from somewhere, and then you're investing in projects that help people like get the skills they need to be competitive in the workforce.
Yeah.
So getting people started, that would also kind of hit stuff like the homelessness problem and things like that. So it can be really difficult to get that first solid footing for a person who's not employed to get into the workforce because you're competing against everyone else who's applying for a job,
Yeah.
and you have to have more experience than them, and then they're trying to be competitive about what they pay you. So yeah,
And I
pretty
would point
difficult
out,
puzzle.
that the policy solutions I just listed were all pretty much free market solutions. You can also do public programs. You can do stuff like better public health care. You can do more things like welfare programs. You can do subsidies to this, that, or the other social program that helps people, like childcare, for example, education. You can do stuff basically that helps pay for stuff that workers have traditionally paid for themselves. And that helps the lower end of the income spectrum because that's historically stuff that they haven't really been able to afford, especially over the past couple decades, since a lot of that stuff has been particularly subject to inflationary forces. Stuff like education and home ownership have seen a lot of inflation and put it well beyond the means of a lot of blue collar workers. So providing greater public services also helps those people out in particular. So that could be another way that you address the problem.
Hmm. And if you do address the problem, you'll need to make a solution that's attractive to people on either side of the political spectrum,
Mhm.
which makes it pretty difficult to do. Because
Yeah,
whenever you list the free market solutions, the people on the right are like, "Ooh, yeah, I like this, yeah." You list the left solutions to it, and the people on the right are like, "What the? You can't do that." So yeah, figuring out what would be a sort of middle ground or a compromise where both sides feel like this is going to help us overall. I think starting from the point of agreement of inflation is putting pressure on the people, like your standard person, and we would like to get our wages going up at a similar rate to how inflation rises, just so we
yeah.
can survive.
Oh yeah, for sure. But just how to do that is like a long running problem, and it's not, from a public policy perspective, it's very difficult to do.
There was a
That,
Kukio quote, I'm not sure where he got this one, but he was saying that in the United States we have millionaires and we have temporarily embarrassed soon to be millionaires. Where we all kind of fancy ourselves as like just that one or two lucky breaks away from us hitting the big time, which makes a lot of people who are more on the poor side or even middle class feel like they deserve to be where they are because if they worked harder or if they got lucky, then they would be in the penthouse suite as well.
Mhm.
John Steinbeck quote, says Fuzzy Cord.
Oh, thank you. I guess it could also be worth mentioning that a lot of that we're talking about income inequality here, and that's thorny. But a lot of people, when they talk about this, also have wealth inequality in mind,
Mm-hmm.
and dealing with wealth inequality is not inherently going to deal with income inequality. You can kind of do a wealth tax type thing and help redistribute that. That could help to a degree. But a lot of the wealth inequality just stems from structural economic factors. Like 30 years ago, there was no Microsoft. Is that right? 1980, right? Thereabouts. I guess that's more like 40 years. So showing my age. 40 years ago, there was no Microsoft. Now there is. So over time, technology has developed that creates the possibility of new industries, and frequently those new technologies are controlled by a relatively small number of people. Generally there's a couple of entrepreneurs that get in early and they benefit disproportionately from the success of that new technology, and the result is considerable wealth concentration. And generally, what happens over time is that the industry matures, it gets regulated, there are new competitors, and over time, that wealth concentration just naturally dissipates. That's pretty much what happened during the last era when that kind of really blew up big, sort of that era of robber barons and whatnot. Obviously, regulation was a big part of that too, antitrust regulation and whatnot. But the wealth inequality dissipated over time as, for one, new wealth was created, but also just as the industries in question matured, it became less and less of a pressing problem. So that was kind of separate. That was a separate issue from income inequality, and it's probably going to require different solutions. But yeah, kind of a meandering answer all over the place. But I'm sure some people would say UBI. There's probably a couple in chat who already have.
More libertarians talking at the moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's one line of thinking that says that, the economy is automating and everything is going to get done by robots. And in that case, workers aren't going to be able to compete and they're going to need some kind of income. So UBI could be that income
Mm-hmm.
in order to keep them going. But whether or not that's going to be politically viable or, whether or not it's even true, even if that's even an accurate portrayal of what's going to happen, all of that is pretty debatable at this point. But that is a possible solution.
Oh, cool.
Oh, are we out of time?
We're about at the 3 hour mark. 2 hour 56, yo.
Oh, wow. Time flies. Well, we never really got to talk about Russia, so do you want to do another 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, we can do 5 minutes for Russia.
5, 10 minutes. Um, so have you heard about the drama, recently?
Mm, the drama
Specifically
in
with the
Russia.
military buildup?
No.
Okay. So this will be new. A couple months ago, Russia kind of built up its military on its border with Ukraine, and there was some question about, are they preparing to invade? Are they trying to intimidate the West? What's the deal? And at the time, it seems to have been more of a feint. In retrospect, it seems like they were just trying to kind of flex and send a signal to the Biden administration that they weren't going to be pushed around. But now there's another buildup happening, and this time there's some evidence, allegedly, that they actually are planning an invasion of Ukraine. There's been some intelligence reports that have been released saying as much. The Ukrainian government, for its part, says that they have intelligence saying that that's what they're doing. So there's some concern at this point that perhaps it's true, although it's still not entirely clear. From what I've read, Russian army units in southwestern Russia are not really in a position yet to invade, but it's expected that they will be by January or February. So just what the Russian government hopes to accomplish here, if they're actually trying to invade, all of that is once again in question. And I think the popular theory right now is more that they're trying to get concessions. I don't think, because an invasion of Ukraine would be very expensive and it would be a problem. It wouldn't just be invade and conquer and that's it. There would be a resistance, there would be an insurrection, guerrilla fighters, what have you. So I don't think the Russian government really relishes that prospect. So the suspicion is then that what the Russians want to do is to try to strong arm the West into some kind of security arrangement for Europe. And the Russian government has already said as much. They've got some kind of security arrangement that they're proposing that could offer some kind of status quo or some kind of equilibrium that could be a status quo going forward. But it's not clear yet what the details are or if the West is really all that interested in that. But that is on the table. I suspect what's going to happen is that the United States is going, well, the United States has already come out and said that it would not send troops to Ukraine if it were invaded. So that's kind of off the table, which was a bit upsetting for people in Eastern Europe. But, given the way politics are in the United States right now, that was inevitable. I mean, people don't want to fight a war for Ukraine, just plainly. There's just been too many interventionist wars over the past couple of decades, and the patience of the American body politic is basically just worn thin. So the Biden administration isn't going to do that, but they have said that they would do more than what they did in 2014 when Russia first invaded eastern Ukraine and Crimea.
Which was what?
Well, at the time, pretty much all they did was send food and maybe some ammunition. I don't even know if they sent ammunition. I think all of the stuff they sent at the time was non-lethal support. So mostly food, radios, stuff like that. Just basic logistical stuff. So now the Biden administration, as well as European countries, whom he kind of coordinated with just recently before he met with Vladimir Putin, they've been releasing a pretty steady drumbeat of threats saying that, they're going to send weapons, they're going to share intelligence, they're going to do this, that, and the other thing that they wouldn't have even considered back in 2014. And of course, sanctions. Russia has sanctions applied to it, but they're pretty targeted. What they're talking about now is just broad-based sanctions that would just kind of cut Russia off from trade with the West, which would be a lot more punishing than anything that they've had to experience thus far. So lots of threats that the West is trying to issue in order to deter Russia here, but whether or not it's going to be enough is an open question. But yeah, that's the drama. The West is trying to deter an invasion that may or may not be in the cards. Russia is trying to extract security concessions that may or may not be in the cards. So it's kind of a game of chicken at this point, you could say.
Yeah. Chicken with tariffs.
Chicken with tariffs.
They want to take the territory, but they're going to get tariffed if they do. Would it be worth it? I would guess
Probably
that
not.
they're probably thinking about that right now. There's the desire to just conquer that I think is just in a lot of militaries. Like, that's what you do as a military, is you go out and kick ass and stuff. So if that set of units are just on the field, there's going to be someone in the building who thinks that that's a good idea.
Oh yeah, there's always that guy.
No, really, this is going to go well for us. We should take the Falkland Islands. They're too
Yeah,
far away to do anything.
same spirit.
Yeah.
Well, to be more detailed as to what the Russians are looking for as far as security guarantees, what they really want is a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. That's like the main thing that they've consistently called for. They also kind of want a guarantee that NATO forces will never be stationed in Ukraine and that there will be limits on the deployment of missile units in Eastern Europe and kind of some peripheral stuff, basically. But the main thing is that they don't want Ukraine in NATO. And, the thing is, I suspect if that's all they want, then they could probably get that without the invasion. So I suspect in the negotiations that are going to play out over the next couple months, then the West will be pretty well inclined to agree that Ukraine should be neutral. I don't know if they'll be willing to concede that Ukraine should be part of the so-called Russian world, as the Russian government has come to call it, basically the Russian sphere of influence. That might be too much for the Europeans, because the Europeans do want to respect to some degree the discretion of the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. But I also don't think they're really willing to fight for them, such that they would intervene to stop a Russian invasion. So Russia kind of has leverage in that sense. Russia would invade. I don't think anybody doubts that. And because the West is not willing to intervene to stop them militarily, that means the Russians have some leverage there. But the West is not without its economic leverage. So I suspect what's going to happen is that there's going to be an agreement that Ukraine should not be part of the Russian world per se, but also that it should not be part of NATO. So there will probably be some like World War II style agreement that Ukraine should be a neutral buffer state, kind of like Germany was supposed to be after World War II. They could do that with Ukraine. I suspect that would be pretty amenable to both sides, but I don't think that's all that Russia wants here, because part of the problem is economic. Russia kind of sees Ukraine as part of its economic sphere of influence as well. There's historically been a lot of manufacturing industries and heavy industries in Ukraine that have been integrated into Russian supply chains. And those linkages have kind of been severed pretty significantly since 2014, but it may be that the Russians are looking to restore them. And the trouble with a neutrality agreement, such as what I described, is that it doesn't stop Ukraine from joining the European Union. And that would pretty firmly put Ukraine in the broader European single market economy, which is very much not a part of the Russian economy.
Hmm.
And I don't know how strongly the Russian government feels about that. Because the Russians have definitely, Russian nationalists who are very much, in power right now, part of their rationale is security based, but part of their rationale is just nationalism. Like Ukraine has always kind of been a part of Russia or the Russian sphere of influence. So it may be that it's not just a security guarantee they want. They may want to reincorporate Ukraine into that sphere of influence that it left in 2014. And if that's what they're after, in addition to a guarantee that they don't join NATO, that's a much bigger ask. And I think in that case, there could be a much greater chance of conflict. Because I don't think Europe cares enough about Ukraine to fight for it, but I do think they care enough to at least pressure Russia to respect their economic sovereignty. And it may be that Russian nationalists see respect for economic sovereignty as nothing less than a pressure campaign to minimize the Russian world. And again, if that's the case, then there's a much higher chance of conflict. So this is the drama we're watching right now in Ukraine. And it'll play out over probably the next 2 months at least until January or February when the Russian army actually can credibly claim to be ready for an actual invasion.
Looks like pretty big stuff. We'll see how it pans out.
We shall see. But yeah, I just wanted to squeeze that in there.
Yeah, kind of a big ticket item for people to watch for next time for sure. Well, cool. We got a nice full episode in today. A lot of South America, good bit of China. And so it goes.
Yeah. Good stuff. Thank you for having me. Always a privilege and much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you, Agent Smith, for coming on. Thank you, Neuro, for handling questions today.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, this will be on YouTube. If you have any questions or comments on it, feel free to leave them in the comments below and we can read those and discuss them later. Or if you have any corrections of stuff that we messed up, we're not here to just spew propaganda. If we can be corrected, we would love to be. So appreciate you all for being pleasant in the chat and sharing your perspectives. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. See you next time.
Go take a walk.
Oh, shit.
Got him. See you next time, man.
See you next time.